Chapter 1. The Whispering Fog. Fog, endless and pale as death's breath. It clung to the crooked timber buildings of Geldstadt like a gauze wrapping a festering wound. The border village, nestled in a forgotten crook between the Stirhugel hills and the black woods of eastern Sylvania, had always suffered under long shadows. But in the past fortnight, those shadows had teeth. It began with a child. Gretchen Laws, only 9 winters old, vanished, gone from her bed before dawn, with the frost still clinging to the windows and no sign of intrusion save for a trail of small, wet footprints leading out her bedroom door and into the mist, dissolving after the second step. Her mother had wailed like a soul struck with witchfire, clawing at the church door until her nails peeled back. Then came the stable boy, then the town clerk, then the priest, and always the same signs: no screams in the night, no blood, only silence and the whisper of the fog, curling through the streets like smoke from a dying hearth. The townsfolk had taken to bolting their doors and hanging garlic in thick braids from their lintels. Iron nails were hammered into thresholds. Old charms, some so ancient their meaning was forgotten, were dredged up from trunks and buried beneath doorsteps. All useless. The disappearances continued, like clockwork, one every 3rd night. The Baron who ruled from the manse on the cliff did nothing. Not that it mattered, his eyes had gone glassy years ago. Some said he fed on laudanum like soup. Others whispered darker things. No one went to the manse any more. On the 17th day of the fog, a rider came. He came not by horse but by foot, a lone figure cloaked in black oilskin, the hem of his coat stiff with dried mud and something darker. He arrived from the east, stepping through the fog as though born of it. He walked with a slight limp and a rhythm to his gait that spoke more of precision than injury. He passed the gallows tree without pause, though the crow perched there gave a shriek and took wing. At his side hung a heavy satchel, bound in tarnished brass clasps, and cradled in his left arm, wrapped in red velvet so dark it was nearly black, was a book, thick, square, and sealed with a crimson wax crest, impressed with an unfamiliar sigil, an inverted crown pierced by a serpent. The villagers saw him pass beneath the arch of the inn, the one-eyed carving of Moor above the door scowling down, and they turned their faces. The stranger's head tilted ever so slightly, as if noting each window shuttered in haste, every breath held behind slatted walls. He spoke no greeting. He asked no questions. He merely stepped inside the inn, the crooked hearth, and set his burden upon the bar. Old Rayner, the innkeep, blinked at the crimson-sealed tome like it was a skaven bomb about to burst. "Room?" the stranger asked, his voice dry, rasped with dust or age or too many unsaid things. Rayner nodded, his hands trembling as he slid a rusted key from beneath the counter. "Upstairs. 3rd, on the left." The man took the key. No coin exchanged, no name given, only that single glance, the kind that strips a man down to marrow. That night, the fog pressed harder. It pressed into cracks in the stone, under eaves and through chimneys. It wormed its way under blankets and against skin. It smelled of earth and mildew and something iron-rich, and with it came the whispers, low, breathless, muttered fragments of words in languages no one in Geldstadt knew. Some said they heard crying, some the sound of scraping claws. But no one left their homes, not that night. Only one man did, Johnny Calvers, the cooper's apprentice, whose sister had gone missing 3 nights before. Grief had festered in him like a rot. He drank until the bottle broke, and then he staggered from his home with a rusted hatchet and a scream on his lips, swearing to carve the demon from the fog. He never returned. only his hatchet, found upright in the square, embedded deep in the cobblestone as though driven by a giant's hand. The next morning, the stranger was waiting in the square, his long coat slick with dew, his breath fogging before him in even, steady clouds. A crowd had gathered, half in fear, half in desperation. "You're a priest?" asked Martefeld, widow of the carpenter. "No." "A witch hunter?" asked the baker's boy, before his mother cuffed him for speaking. "No." "Then what in Sigmar's name are you?" someone finally asked. The stranger turned, slowly. His eyes were pale gray, almost silver in the dawn light, not glowing, just flat, like still water with something dead floating beneath. "I am a man with knowledge," he said. "What kind?" asked Rayner, who had followed him down from the inn. "What use is a book against this fog?" The stranger unwrapped the tome. Even in the morning light, the crimson seal pulsed like a wound. He held it up, its cover a patchwork of ancient, flayed skin inked with symbols that made even the illiterate squint in discomfort. "This is Liber Sanguinus, the Blood Book, written by the mad chronicler Volmund Dreg in the year 118 after Sigmar's passing. It tells of curses bound in flesh, of queens who sleep beneath the roots of mountains, and of the signs that precede their waking." He looked around at the grim faces. "You know the signs." There was silence. Then Marta whispered, "The dreams, the bleeding sky, the fog that whispers in the voice of the dead," finished the stranger. He turned and walked toward the chapel ruins, its spire long since collapsed, its stones blackened by an old fire. The townsfolk followed, slowly, as if drawn by some thread. The stranger stepped over the threshold and knelt before the altar stone, now moss-slick and fractured. He placed the book down, pressed his palm to the seal, and broke it. The wax split with a sound like tearing flesh. The book hissed as if exhaling something trapped inside for centuries. Pages turned of their own accord, fluttering to a passage marked by a stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The stranger read aloud, "When the 13th soul is taken beneath a bloodless moon, and the fog walks unbidden by wind or season, then shall the Queen of Crimson stir, she who once drank empires dry, who turned the moons black with ash, shall rise again from bone and grave dust, and her children shall go before her, taking the breath of the world, one soul at a time." The villagers stared. Some wept, others turned pale. The stranger stood. "She is waking. Somewhere beneath these hills, in vaults lost to time, buried in the folds of what you call your land. This village is the first of many. If the rite is completed, there will be no sun, no Stirland, no empire, only blood." "Then stop her," someone cried. "You said you had knowledge." "I do," said the stranger, "but knowledge is not salvation. It is a map, a weapon. The blade still needs a hand." "And what if no one here is brave enough?" asked Marta, her voice shaking. The stranger turned his gaze on her, soft, almost kind. "Then Geldstadt will vanish, as will your children, your names, and every stone that made this place a home. Forgotten, like so many others. No one spoke after that." The fog returned that night, thicker, redder, whispering louder than ever, and somewhere beneath the village, unseen and ancient, a heartbeat began to stir, slow, heavy, unholy. Thump, thump, thump. Chapter 2. The Scholar and the Soldier. Professor Emil Kreuzherr had not slept. He sat hunched over the scarred oak table in the crooked hearth's upper room, shoulders bowed beneath the weight of years, eyes rimmed red and shining with a scholar's fever. Candles guttered around him in a loose circle, their tallow stink mixing with old ink and the faint copper tang that clung to the pages of the book before him. Outside the narrow window, fog pressed its pallid face against the glass, breathing softly, as if listening. The Liber Sanguinis lay open. Its pages resisted the eye. The script, if it could be called that, shifted when stared at too long, letters seeming to crawl like maggots through dried blood. Emil's fingers trembled as he traced a passage, lips moving soundlessly as he translated from a dead dialect older than the empire itself. He had sworn, years ago, never to touch such texts again. That oath had been made in a lecture hall in Altdorf, before a tribunal of robed men who smelled of incense and self-righteousness. They had stripped him of his chair, his titles, and very nearly his life when his research crossed an invisible line between sanctioned death study and forbidden communion. Necromancy, they had spat, as though the word itself were filth. They had not burned him. That mercy had come only because Emil Kreutzer had begged, debased himself, sworn ignorance and youthful folly. He had fled east soon after, carrying with him only what knowledge he could not excise from his mind, and now it had followed him. The candle nearest the book flickered violently. Emil froze. The flame leaned sideways, guttering toward the window, though no wind stirred. Then came a knock at the door. 3 raps, hard, measured. Emil closed the book at once, hands shaking, and wrapped it in the red velvet. He slid it beneath the table just as the door creaked open. The man who entered filled the doorway like a slab of carved stone. Captain Aldrich Vaughn did not remove his helmet. The battered steel bore dents and scratches layered upon one another, like a history written in blows. His breastplate was Stirland issue, dulled with age, the sigil of the province half scraped away. A long sword hung at his side, its hilt wrapped in fresh leather, its pommel nicked where a blade had once slid too close. His eyes, visible beneath the helmet's rim, were the eyes of a man who had watched too many others die screaming. "You're Kreutzer," Vaughn said. His voice was low, roughened by old smoke and older anger. "The scholar." "I was," Emil replied, "before the world decided it no longer wanted scholars." Vaughn stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room felt smaller at once. He glanced at the candles, the ink-stained fingers, the satchel at Emil's feet. "And now?" the captain asked. "Now I am what necessity makes of me," Emil said quietly. "And you are a soldier far from a battlefield." Vaughn snorted. "This is a battlefield. The enemy just doesn't wear banners." He unbuckled his helmet and set it on the table with a solid clank. His hair was iron-gray, cropped short, his face scored by an old saber cut that had healed badly. He smelled of wet wool, oil, and blood, fresh blood. "You came east because of the disappearances," Emil said. "I came because my men are dead," Vaughn replied flatly. 3 patrols sent into the hills found what was left of the last one this morning." He reached into a pouch at his belt and tossed something onto the table. A hand. It was severed at the wrist, the flesh pale and waxy, the veins collapsed. The fingers were stiff, curled slightly inward. No blood had stained the stump. Emil swallowed. "Drained," Vaughn continued. "Not torn, not eaten, taken, like wine from a cup." Emil closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was no surprise left in them, only dread. "It has begun, then," he murmured. Vaughn leaned forward, planting both gauntleted hands on the table. The candles trembled again. "You're going to tell me exactly what it is," he said. "Because if this is some scholar's fancy—" "It is not," Emil interrupted sharply, the old academic steel flashing through his fear. He pulled the book from beneath the table and laid it between them. Vaughn recoiled half a step, hand going to his sword without conscious thought. "What in More's name is that?" "The reason your men are dead," Emil said, "and unless we act, the reason this entire province will follow them." He opened the book again, flipping to a page marked by a jagged tear. "This prophecy," he said. "I dismissed it once. Most did. It was catalogued among apocrypha mad monk ravings, post-plague hysteria, but the signs aligned too precisely." He read, his voice growing steadier as the words took hold. "When the fog walks against the wind, and blood is taken without blade, and the 13th death passes unwept, then shall Vereza stir in her crimson sleep." And Vaughn stiffened. "Say that name again." "Vereza," Emil said. "The Crimson Queen, a vampire of the elder bloodlines, older than Sylvania as men know it. She was not merely a predator, she was a conqueror." "Vampires," Vaughn said, spitting the word. "I've killed them, burned them. They bleed, they die. Not like her," Emil replied. He turned the book so Vaughn could see an illustration, a towering female figure crowned in barbed iron, her mouth open in a scream or a laugh, rivers of stylized blood flowing from her hands to kneeling figures below. "She ruled during the time of the fractured principalities," Emil said, "when the empire was still a dream and the dead walked openly. Entire cities fed her. She did not hide in crypts, she sat on thrones. And she was killed," Vaughn said. "No," Emil corrected softly. "She was bound." He flipped to another passage, stained darker than the rest. A conclave of mortal kings, priests, and traitor vampires turned on her. They could not destroy her body, it reformed, again and again. So they entombed her beneath the earth, bound by blood rites and living sacrifices. 13 seals, 13 guardians, 13 deaths to wake her. Vaughn straightened slowly. "The disappearances," he said. Emil nodded. "Each soul taken feeds the rite, not consumed, offered." The captain's jaw tightened. His hands clenched until the leather of his gloves creaked. "How many?" he asked. Emil did not look up. 11, he said. "If the signs are true." Silence filled the room, thick as the fog outside. "Then we have time," Vaughn said finally. 2 lives. 2. And or 1 night," Emil replied. "The fog grows bolder, the whispers louder. Once the 12th falls, the final seal weakens." "And the 13th?" Vaughn asked. Emil met his gaze. "The 13th is never taken," he said. "The 13th comes willingly." Vaughn laughed, harsh and humorless. "No one would walk into that." "Cults exist," Emil said. "Those who worship power, immortality, fear." Vaughn turned away, pacing the room like a caged wolf. "Then we find them," he growled. "I'll drag every last one of them into the light, and—" "You cannot sword your way through this," Emil snapped. "This is not a battlefield, you understand. The enemy is patient, ancient. It has waited centuries." Vaughn whirled on him. "And what would you do, Professor? Read at it until it goes away?" Emil stood, his thin frame shaking with a fury that surprised them both. "I would know it," he said. "Know its rights, its weaknesses, its history. Knowledge is the only blade that has ever cut monsters like this." They stood there, candlelight flickering between them, 2 broken men forged by different failures. "At last?" Vaughn exhaled. "Then we do this together," he said. "Your knowledge, my steel." Emil nodded, exhaustion washing over him. "Then we must move quickly," he said, "because Veressa is no longer dreaming." As if summoned by the words, a scream echoed from the street below. High, abrupt, cut short. Van snatched up his helmet and sword in one smooth motion. "Then the 12th has fallen," he said. Outside, the fog surged forward, thick and eager, and deep beneath the hills, something old and terrible smiled in its sleep. Chapter 3. The Crimson Codex. They sealed themselves in the cellar beneath the crooked hearth as the night came down like a blade. The inn's upper rooms had grown to expose too many windows, too many listening gaps where the fog pressed its pale mouth to the glass. Below, the cellar smelled of damp earth, old ale, and rot. Thick stone walls wept moisture. Iron hooks jutted from the beams where hogs had once been strung up, their shadows swaying in the candlelight like hanged men stirring in their sleep. Professor Emil Kreutzer sat at a butcher's block, repurposed as a desk, his spine curved, his breath shallow. Across from him, Captain Aldrich Van stood watch at the cellar steps, sword drawn, eyes fixed upward. Every creak of the inn above sent his muscles coiling, ready to strike. Between them lay the Crimson Codex. It was worse in full candlelight. The book resisted being opened, its spine stiff as a corpse long dead, its cover warm to the touch, despite the chill. Emil had wrapped his hands in cloth before touching it again, but even through the layers he felt a faint throb, slow, rhythmic, like a pulse. He swallowed and forced the cover back. The pages were not parchment, not truly. They had once been skin, human skin, stretched and cured, still bearing faint impressions of pores and scars. Ink seeped unnaturally deep into them. Lines etched in a dark brown that gleamed wetly when the light caught it wrong. Emil had read many forbidden texts, grimoire fragments, mortuary catechisms, necromantic theses written in the margins of prayer books. None of them had wanted to be read like this. "Sigmar preserve us," Van muttered from the stairs. "Sigmar does not come here," Emil replied without looking up. If he ever did. The Codex began with a genealogy not of kings or bloodlines as men understood them, but of hunger. Names flowed across the pages in branching patterns, titles etched beside them in mocking reverence. Countess of the Bleeding March, Mistress of the Black Chalice, she who drinks the Sunday. And at the center of it all, Veressa. Her name was written in a deeper pigment, almost black, each letter jagged as if carved with a blade. Around it, symbols had been drawn and redrawn, circled obsessively, scratched out and overwritten by hands that had not trusted themselves. Emil leaned closer, lips trembling as he translated. "She was born before borders," he whispered, "before Stirland, before Sylvania, before the Empire dared call itself whole." He turned the page. The illustration that followed made his stomach lurch. A mountain dominated the image, rendered in thick strokes of ash-gray and rust-red, its peak split like a wound, its slopes studded with crypts and fortresses in various states of ruin. Beneath it, carved into the bedrock, lay a colossal chamber vaulted, ribbed like the inside of a rib cage. At its center, a sarcophagus, not stone, bone, layer upon layer of fused remains, shaped into a coffin large enough to house something not entirely human. Chains wrapped it, inscribed with sigils that burned the eye. 13 pylons surrounded it, each bearing a robed figure with their arms outstretched, blood pouring from their wrists into channels cut into the floor. Emil exhaled shakily. "Mount Narthex," he said. "That's what they called it then. A peak swallowed by forest and ruin. It's, God's help us, it still exists." Varn turned from the stairs. "I've marched those hills," he said. "There's a mountain east of here, Broken Peak, old watchtower on the ridge. Locals won't go near it, because they are wiser than most," Emil replied. He read on. The Codex spoke, not in grand mythic tones, but in cold, meticulous detail, of armies drained dry in a single night, of rivers fouled with corpses stacked so thick the water overflowed its banks, of Vereza seated upon a throne made from the spines of rival vampire lords, her lips red with victory. "She was not merely undead," Emil said hoarsely. "She was ascendant. Feeding refined her. Each massacre sharpened her mind, hardened her flesh. By the end, steel glanced from her skin. Fire dimmed in her presence." Varn's grip tightened on his sword. "So, how did they stop her?" Emil turned another page. His hands shook harder now. "They betrayed her," he said. "Her own kind. Vampires who feared that she would eclipse them all. They allied with mortals, priests, kings, witch hunters. Together they lured her into the mountain under the guise of parley." The page showed a procession winding up the mountain path, torches held high, banners snapping in an unseen wind. At their center, Vereza walked unbound, her posture regal, her face turned toward the viewer. She was smiling. "They used a weapon," Emil continued. "Not steel, not magic alone. A rite of sacrifice so immense it scarred the land itself. I do," he translated aloud, voice cracking, 13 monks of the Order of the Pale Vigil, men who had renounced the world, their names, their futures. Each bound themselves to a seal, each pouring their life force into the prison. They did not die. They were anchored. Varn frowned. "Anchored?" Emil nodded grimly. "Living seals. As long as they endured entombed, starving, praying, she slept. The cellar felt suddenly colder." "And when they died?" Varn asked. Emil did not answer at first. He turned the page. The illustration showed the monks centuries later, withered husks fused to their pylons, mouths open in silent screams. Beneath the image, a single line of text had been gouged deep enough to tear the page. "When the last vigil breaks, the queen draws breath." Varn swore softly. "The disappearances," he said, "the blood rites. They're not just feeding her. They're killing the seals." "Yes," Emil whispered. "One by one. The monks are dying, or being destroyed." He flipped through the remaining pages rapidly now, driven by dread. The Codex detailed the Order of the Pale Vigil in obsessive thoroughness, their founding, their vows, the location of their monasteries. "They did not remain at the mountain," Emil said. "Once the prison was complete, the survivors scattered. They founded hidden cloisters across the region. Each one held knowledge of the rites. Each one monitored a seal." Varn slammed a gauntleted fist against the wall. "Then that's where we go," he growled. "Find these monasteries. Protect what's left." Emil's expression darkened. "The Codex ends abruptly," he said. "Here." The final pages were torn, ragged at the edges. Ink splattered them chaotically, as if written during flight or madness. "The Order was hunted," Emil read. "Cultists. Vampires loyal to Vereza. Something else as well, something internal. Schism, betrayal." His breath caught. "One of the monks broke their vows," he said. "Sought immortality. The codex names him, but the name is scratched out. Only the title remains. Vaughn leaned closer. What title? Emil swallowed. The first witness. Silence fell between them. Above, the inn groaned as something heavy moved across its floorboards. A slow drag. A pause. Another drag. Vaughn raised his sword, eyes burning. "We're not alone," he whispered. From the darkness, at the foot of the stairs, came a sound like wet cloth tearing. Then a shape slid into view, once a man, now bloated and pale, his veins blackened beneath translucent skin. His jaw hung slack, his eyes milk-white and unseeing. Blood crusted his mouth, but none stained his hands. A thrall. It lurched forward with a hiss. Vaughn moved without hesitation. He stepped in and drove his blade through its chest. The creature screamed a thin, piercing sound and clawed at him with surprising strength. Vaughn wrenched the sword free and hacked again, taking its head off in a spray of dark, syrupy gore. The body thrashed for a moment, then lay still. Emil starred, heart hammering. "They're close," he whispered. "Too close." Vaughn wiped his blade on the corpse's clothes. "Then we move at dawn," he said. "Mountain, monasteries, whatever's left." Emil gathered the codex, wrapping it carefully despite the way it seemed to resist, its pages whispering as they closed. Outside, the fog pressed tighter against the walls, as if angered. And far away, beneath Mount Narthex, something ancient shifted in its bone-bound coffin, chains rattling softly in the dark. Chapter 4. The Dagger of Valthur. The chapel had been dead for a long time. Once it had crowned the rise above Geltstadt's western edge, its bell tower standing proud against the ever-churning sky. Now it slumped like a drunken sentinel, spine cracked, shingles torn free by wind and time. Moss and mildew had conquered its stonework, and wild roses black and thorn-thick twined through its shattered windows. Crows had made a home in the rafters, and sometimes, when the fog lifted, their cries echoed like a congregation still mourning. It was here that Vaughn and Kreutzer came with the first grey blush of dawn, guided by whispers from the codex and half-buried rumor. "They say the old priest went mad before the chapel fell," Vaughn said, boots crunching over broken glass. "Claimed angels walked backwards through his dreams, drew a blade in the air and said it could kill death." Kreutzer said nothing, eyes scanning the rotten ruin, hands tight on the wrapped book beneath his coat. Inside, the air was heavy sodden with age and stillness. What had once been an altar was now a lichen-slick stone slab, half collapsed. The cruciform stained glass that would have once cast color across the pews was little more than jagged remnants, casting fractured shadows like fangs across the damp floor. It was beneath the altar that they found the reliquary, iron-bound, sealed with wax long since dried and crumbling. Kreutzer muttered prayers to no god in particular as he broke the seal. Vaughn stood behind him, sword drawn. The relic was a dagger, not ornate, not gilded. Its handle was bone-human, likely, wrapped in strips of old leather. The blade itself was black steel, mottled with dark red veins that shimmered faintly in the morning gloom. Its shape was strange, triangular, with a hollow groove down the center, as though designed not to cut, but to drink. Kreutzer stared, pale. "The dagger of Valthur," he whispered. "I thought it legend." Vaughn's grip tightened. "Who was Valthur? A priest of Mor," the scholar said. "Or perhaps something older. The texts disagree. He fashioned the blade after his own bloodline was slaughtered by a vampire matron, claimed the dagger could sever the soul from the undead." End them, truly. Varn leaned closer. I've seen a dozen holy relics. Most were trinkets. This feels different. It is, Emil replied. The blade is alchemically treated, fed with the marrow of the dead. Its enchantment is not of divine grace, but sheer, refined hatred. The captain grunted. Good. We'll need it. They wrapped it carefully, binding the dagger in oilcloth and sealing it within Varn's pack. Neither man spoke of the way the shadows in the chapel seemed to twitch as the blade was lifted, or how the air seemed to exhale, just once, with something like relief. That night, it was stolen. The crooked hearth was quieter than usual, too quiet. A tension hung in the rafters, a taut silence wrapped around every word. The villagers drank without speaking, eyes cast low, glancing toward the door as though expecting something or someone to burst through. Varn and Kreutzer returned late from reconnoitering the western ridgeline. When they entered, Rayner met them at the threshold with a pale face and a shaking hand. Baron Ekron's rider came down from the manse, he said. Called a gathering. Wants all of Geltstad's men at the square tomorrow morning. Why? Varn asked. Said the Baron has news of a blessing. Something to protect us. Varn's eyes narrowed. The Baron hasn't spoken to his own court in years. Now he wants to rally the town? Rayner nodded slowly. And he looked wrong. His skin's too tight, his smile too wide. Said the fog was a gift. Varn turned to Emil. The scholar had gone white. We need to check the blade, he whispered. They rushed upstairs. The dagger was gone. The pack had been slit with surgical precision. No blood, no sign of struggle, just the oilcloth, unwrapped, and a trail of damp footprints, bare and oddly wide, leading to the shutters. Someone had taken it into the fog. Baron Ekran had once been a man of dignity. In his youth, he'd fought at Fieldorf's defense, his name whispered in the courts of Stirland as a rising star. Then came the incident. No one remembered the full details, only that his estate burned, his wife died, and he withdrew to Geltstadt's cliffside manse. There, he aged behind locked doors, tending to his father's debts and his own isolation. That was before the fog came. Now, he stood in the town square, resplendent in a doublet of black velvet threaded with gold. His eyes were ringed with shadows, his skin unnaturally smooth, as if pulled taut over muscle that pulsed too close to the surface. He smiled with too many teeth. Brothers, sisters, he said, arms spread as though embracing them. You have suffered, you have feared, but I bring you salvation. Behind him stood 6 figures, cloaked and hooded, silent as tombstones. One held something wrapped in dark cloth, long, thin, unmistakably blade-shaped. Kreuzer's breath caught. The dagger, he whispered. He's using it, Varn growled. How the hell did he even know? Emil's lips were thin. He's not Ekran anymore. The Baron stepped down from the dais. There is no need to fear the dark, he said. No need to hide behind garlic and iron and old prayers. The night does not hate you, it wants to embrace you. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some backed away. Others stepped forward. A farmer, a miller's son, Marta, the widow. Faces Varn had once seen praying in the ruined chapel now turned toward the Baron with hollow eyes and slack jaws. He's turned them, Varn said. Damn it, he's building a court. A cloaked figure stepped forward and peeled back their hood. It was the stable boy, except his eyes were milky, his mouth torn at the corners to make room for 2 long teeth. Emil grabbed Varn's arm. We have to move now. If the dagger's corrupted, Varn was already running. They pushed through the edge of the gathering as the Baron raised his arms. "We are the chosen of the Crimson Queen," he intoned, "and the seal of Valthor shall be broken in her name." The cloaked figure holding the dagger stepped forward, unwrapping the cloth. The blade was no longer black. It was red, pulsing, alive. Varn charged. He struck the cloaked bearer in the chest before the dagger could be raised. The figure collapsed with a choking hiss. Varn seized the relic and screamed. The dagger bit into his palm without moving. His skin sizzled where it touched the handle. Visions filled his mind, a mountain dripping blood, a woman in a crown of thorns laughing beneath the earth, a scream that lasted centuries. He fell back, gasping, the blade clattering free. "Kill them!" Ekron howled. The cloaked figures surged forward. Thralls, half-turned, some clawed, some bit. Others simply moaned as they reached with unnatural speed. Varn slashed. Emil threw vials, concoctions mixed in alchemical panic. One exploded in fire. Another hissed green and corrosive. Flesh melted. Teeth shattered. But there were too many. "Retreat!" Varn roared, shoving Emil toward the alley behind the baker's shop. They escaped into shadow. The dagger abandoned in the square. As they fled, Emil glanced back. Ekran held the blade now, high above his head. "The Queen rises," he cried, "and we drink to her eternal night." The crowd roared, and from the depths of the fog, something answered. A deep, resounding hum that shook the ground, like a tomb unlocking, like a coffin lid groaning open after too long sealed. The dagger had chosen a side, and he wasn't theirs. Chapter 5. The Cult of the Crimson Veil. The sky over Geltstadt bled rust. Sunrise should have brought relief, but instead it cast the fog in sickly orange hues, making it look like the world was drenched in old gore. The air reeked of damp ash and something fouler, something sweet and decaying, like fruit left too long in the sun, bursting with worms. Captain Aldrich Varn stood beneath the gnarled corpse tree at the edge of town, blade drawn, every muscle taut. Blood dried in a dark arc along his right arm. Behind him, Professor Emil Kreutzer clutched a cracked lantern, flame guttering as it struggled against the thickening mist. They hadn't stopped running since the square. The cult had spread like rot fast, silent and invisible, until it was too late. By the time Varn had dragged Emil into the tree line, half the village had chanted the Crimson Queen's name, and worse, the dagger was now in Baron Ekron's hands, or whatever was wearing his skin. "They'll hunt us now," Emil whispered, breathless. "They know we're a threat." "They already knew," Varn replied, voice like grinding stone. "But now they're organized." They'd gone west deeper into the forest, toward a ruined logging outpost Kreutzer remembered from the Codex's annotations, a place where, centuries ago, a monk from the Pale Vigil had hidden in self-imposed exile, claiming visions of the Queen even while the Order still held her bound. If any clues remained, they would be there. But the woods were shifting, paths warped subtly. Stones reappeared where they hadn't been. Trees twisted toward the pair as if leaning closer to listen. Emil muttered warding rites beneath his breath, but they sounded limp, stripped of power. It wasn't magic, not as scholars knew it. This was older, hungrier, a presence behind the veil of the world, pushing outward. The Crimson Queen stirred. They found the logging camp at dusk, or what was left of it. The buildings had collapsed decades ago, roofs caved in, walls leaning drunkenly against one another, soaked through with moss and fungal blooms. But something remained, Beneath a skeletal chapel, no more than 2 walls and an altar stone, they uncovered a hatch, hand-cut. Emil murmured, running fingers over the iron bolts. Centuries old, not local. Van levered it open. Stale air wafted out, dry and bitter. And beneath it, stairs descending into black. No hesitation. Down they went. They lit torches. Lanterns would be useless in such close, irregular corridors. The walls were tight-packed stone, each block etched faintly with glyphs Kreutzer recognized, early symbols of the Pale Vigil. Simple, stoic, designed to contain, not glorify. Then they reached the chamber. It was a library, or what had once been one. Scrolls had long since crumbled to mulch, but carved tablets and lacquered wood slats remained, each tucked in stone cubbies. The air pulsed with latent dread. Kreutzer's torch flickered wildly, and at the far wall, mounted above a crude altar, hung a tapestry of red and black silk. It was pristine, unweathered, new. The Crimson Queen was depicted not in her monstrous form, but as a goddess of beauty, crimson-veiled, arms outstretched, blood pouring from her palms into the mouths of adoring supplicants. Behind her loomed a stylized mountain, Mount Narthex, unmistakably with veins of silver splitting its roots. The cult of the Crimson Veil, Kreutzer whispered. They were real. Worshippers of Ereza who splintered off after her sealing. Most texts claimed they were wiped out by the Sigmarites in 931 IC. Clearly not, Varn growled. They moved to examine the altar. Fresh bloodstains marked it, dried in strange glyphs. That's when they heard the singing. Soft, choral, female voices layered over one another in gentle harmony, wafting down from the hatch above. Then the torchlight went out, not from wind, from will. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Emil screamed as something cold brushed his neck. Van struck blade, arcing in pure instinct, and felt resistance. A hiss, the crunch of bone. The floor shook with sudden motion. Figures poured in, silent, masked, robed. They wore smooth white porcelain masks shaped like mourning faces, each identical. Tear tracks painted in dried blood beneath black eye slits. Their robes were crimson and hooded, flowing like water through the shadows. They did not speak, did not cry out, only struck. Van met the first with a boot to the knee and brought his sword down in a brutal cleave. The mask split, revealing a face beneath half-rotted, stitched at the jaw, tongue blackened. Thrall, dead, yet not. Another lunged for Kreutzer. Emil stumbled back, smashing the torch against the floor flame, licking at the robed attacker's hem. Fire took it screaming, lighting the darkness in orange chaos. Van fought like a man-possessed blade, flashing, parrying, cutting, but they just kept coming. They're not trying to kill us, Emil shouted. They're trying to take us. Van understood instantly. He rammed his shoulder into one, cracking ribs, and grabbed Kreutzer by the collar. They ran through the narrow halls, past sigil-slick walls, chased by those singing voices that never rose in anger, only mournful lament. The cultists moved in eerie synchrony, always just behind, never tripping, never panting. The two emerged into night at a dead sprint. Behind them, the hatch slammed shut on its own. The singing stopped. Only the wind remained howling like wolves across the broken chapel stones. They collapsed beneath a blackthorn tree half a league from the ruin, gasping. Blood streaked Van's face. Emil had a gash across his temple, one eye swollen. "What in Moor's name are they?" Van rasped. Emil shivered. "Fanatics, half dead, part of some ritual. I think they've transcended the need to speak. Who leads them? Emil hesitated. The texts called her the Mother of Veils, successor to the last of Vereza's handmaidens. Possibly immortal, possibly possessed. Do they know where we're going? I don't think they care, Emil said. They know where they're going. Their path is already set. To awaken her, Van growled. No matter what, a silence stretched between them. They won't stop, Emil whispered. They believe they'll be made pure, fed upon, chosen. They'll be cattle, Van spat. No, Emil replied, voice hollow. They want to be. They see it as glory. Every age has its zealots. Theirs just traded fire for blood. Van stared into the trees, jaw clenched. They want to give the world to a god who drinks people alive. Yes, then we find them, Van said, standing, and we burn their fucking veils. Far away, in the bowels of the manse above Geldstadt, Baron Ekran stood before a pool of dark, still water. Around him knelt the cult of the Crimson Veil, singing their endless hymn. He held the dagger aloft, and from the pool a woman's voice, soft, rich, ageless, slid through the chamber like silk soaked in blood. 13 will open the path. You are 12. Yes, my queen, Ekran whispered. One remains. Bring him, and I shall rise. Chapter 6. Blood on the Belfry. Dawn bled across Geldstadt in streaks of rust and bruised violet, the light filtering through the fog like the sun had forgotten how to rise. A silence hung over the village, not the hush of early morning, but something more primal. The silence of prey too afraid to scream. The church bell did not toll that morning. No echo stirred the chill mist that rolled between the crooked houses, nor did any call to prayer rise from the chapel steps. That absence was what drew Van's attention. For all its isolation, Geldstadt's rhythm beat predictably. Bell at dawn, mass at 8, curfew at dusk. The old priest, Father Brennick, had not missed a tolling in 30 years, until today. Captain Aldrich Van stood at the chapel's outer gate, fingers resting lightly on the hilt of his blade. The wrought iron fence was bent near the hinges, the frost-cloaked grass within trampled by more than boots. Something larger clawed. Behind him, a small cluster of villagers had gathered, speaking in low, panicked voices. "Forest devils," muttered one, wringing his cap in bony hands. "Same as took my boy last month. Could be a bear," offered another, without conviction. "Some old thing from the pines, driven down by the fog." Van ignored them. The cold was biting through his coat, but it was not the cold that made his skin crawl. It was the absence of bird song, the absence of anything living. He pushed the chapel doors open. The hinges groaned like dying lungs. Inside, the pews were undisturbed, the altar draped in faded red cloth, the icons of Moor crooked in their sconces, candles untouched, chalice polished, but it smelled wrong. Not rot, not death, copper, wet stone, the scent of an open wound still weeping. He stepped inside, boots echoing on the stone. Fog drifted lazily through a shattered stained glass window near the rafters, seeping in like smoke. His eyes followed it upward toward the belfry. A single rope hung from the trapdoor, frayed and swaying slightly, and something was dripping from above. Slow, rhythmic, plip, plip. He ascended the narrow wooden steps, sword drawn now, eyes scanning every shadow. The belfry smelled like a slaughterhouse. Ravens were perched in a tight circle along the beams, silent and still, as though carved from pitch. Their eyes followed Van without blinking. One let out a single, rasping caw, a sound that seemed almost like a warning. He reached the final step and stopped. Father Brennick hung from the bell's support beam, upside down, suspended by ropes knotted tight around his ankles. His cassock was soaked dark from the waist up. His face was a waxy white, mouth open in a silent O, eyes wide with horror and something worse, ecstasy. The skin at his throat had been opened with surgical precision, not torn, not clawed, a single vertical line through which every drop of blood had been extracted. Vaughn stepped closer. The blood hadn't pooled. There was none on the floor, only the dried smears of crimson handprints trailing down the wall, small, child-sized, each descending into the open hatchway below. He cursed under his breath and turned away. As he descended, he found Emil waiting in the aisle, the codex clutched tight beneath his coat. "You were right," Farn said grimly. "He's dead, drained, whole blood volume taken, no spatter, too clean for animals." Emil's jaw clenched. "A feeding, then, the third in as many days, each cleaner than the last." "Wasn't just feeding," Varn said. "They displayed him, ritualistic." He led the scholar to the belfry, letting him see the priest's corpse for himself. Emil's face blanched as he took in the scene. "No scent of decay," he murmured. "They were here last night, maybe even just before dawn." Varn nodded, leaving no trail, nothing to track. "They're mocking us, or testing us," Emil added. "Watching how close we'll come before the final rite." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then came the sound of weeping. Outside, they descended swiftly, emerging into the courtyard where the villagers now knelt, eyes wide, faces pale. A woman sobbed against the chapel fence, her hands clutched around the head of a small boy. "Tom," she cried. "He's gone. He was here just an hour ago. He was just here." Kreutzer stepped back instinctively. "Not another one." Varn crouched beside the woman, noting the bruises on her wrists, restraints. The fog stains on the child's toy, still resting on the chapel step. "They took him during the priest's murder," he said. "They're moving faster, growing bolder." Emil's breath caught. "Then we're close to 13. Varn stood. "We need to speak to Ekran now." The manse was worse than before. Its walls seemed to bend under some unseen pressure. The windows no longer reflected light correctly. The guards, once silent and stoic, now stood like statues, motionless, pale, staring with unblinking eyes at something far beyond the horizon. Varn pushed past them. Inside, the air pulsed with heat, unnatural, foul. Every candle burned with blood-colored flame, casting elongated shadows that moved a moment too slowly. Baron Ikran waited in the great hall. He sat atop a throne of bone-white wood, bare-chested, skin stretched tight over muscle that twitched independently. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural sheen, lips curled into a smile too wide, too wet. "Captain Varn," he said, voice like velvet over broken glass. "Professor Kreutzer, have you come to repent?" "Vandry Steel. We found Brennick," Ekran chuckled. "He offered himself, you know. He prayed for the Queen's mercy. He wept with gratitude when she showed him her face." "Where is the child?" Emil asked, trembling. The Baron's smile deepened. "Already part of something greater." He raised a hand, and one of the guards stepped forward, no longer a man, but a thing wearing a man's shape. Its eyes were stitched shut. Its mouth had been replaced with a gaping, tooth-ringed maw that gurgled like a child choking on laughter. Kreutzer staggered back. "You're accelerating the ritual," Varn said, stepping in front of Emil. You'll burn the seals too fast. I want them to burn, Ekron said, voice rising. The Crimson Queen waits. She watches. She hungers. Her chains are cracking with every death, every offering. He stood, and the hall darkened. Varn's blade lashed out. But Ekron didn't move, didn't flinch. He merely looked at Varn, and the captain staggered backward, eyes wide, breath caught. For a moment, he saw her, not the Baron, her, Varessa, a shadow of a face behind his. Lips red with old blood, eyes like the last moment before drowning, a voice in his skull whispering sweet, perfect oblivion. Then Emil grabbed him, dragging him backward through the archway. "Run!" the scholar screamed. They did, back through the ruined streets, past twisted trees and fog that whispered their names. They ran, and behind them, in the manse above Geldstadt, the bell tolled once, low, hungry, final. Chapter 7. The Witch of Draken Hollow. The trail to Draken Hollow twisted like a gut-string through the trees, slick with mud and half-frozen muck, every step sucking at the boots of those foolish enough to walk it. No birds called here, no insects stirred. Even the wind, once constant in the dense Stirland forests, held its breath. Captain Aldrich Varn had known war. He had marched through corpse fields at Nachtmund and held the line at Verloren's wall while the sky wept fire. But the silence of Draken Hollow unsettled him more than any battlefield. It was the quiet of a wound that refused to scab, a place where reality had thinned. Behind him, Professor Emil Kreutzer stumbled over a root, catching himself with a hiss. "How much farther?" he muttered, sweat streaking through the grime on his brow despite the cold. "Not far," Varn grunted, pushing through the tangle of skeletal branches. "You sure she's still alive?" "If she isn't," Emil said, "we're already dead." The forest opened without warning. Draken Hollow wasn't so much a village as it was a scar on the land. No roads, no paths, just a ring of crooked huts sagging around a dry well. The earth was black here, not with ash but something deeper. Every step felt like it might give way to something buried beneath. And at the center, under a leaning willow that should not have survived this soil, was a hut of woven bone and feather, Madame Voska's home. Smoke drifted from the chimney, thin and white as ghost breath. Symbols carved in tallow and blood dangled from every eave sigils of warding, or perhaps summoning, their meanings long lost to men. They approached. A voice croaked from within. "Enter, both of you, quickly. The fog doesn't wait forever." The door creaked open. Inside, the warmth was stifling. Herbs and rot mingled in a cloying haze. Feathers hung in bunches from the rafters, slick with grease. The walls were papered in animal hides, each scratched with constellations that bore no resemblance to the night sky. A fire crackled in the hearth, but gave off no light. Madame Voska sat cross-legged on a pile of bones and cushions. Her skin was the color of old paper, her eyes milky, but not blind. They fixed on Varn first, then Kreutzer, then something beyond them both. She smiled without warmth. Her teeth were black. "Two men walk through death to ask a dead woman questions," she rasped. "What does that say of the world?" "That it's ending," Emil said. Voska chuckled. "Always is." Varn stepped forward, laying the Crimson Codex on a stool shaped from a kneecap. "You know what this is," he said. "I do." Her long fingers twitched, spider-like. "You want to stop her, the Red One, the sleeper beneath. But you are already too late." "We've still time," Emil snapped. There are still seals unbroken. Voska tilted her head. Time is not the friend you think it is. Time is her herald. She rose with surprising grace and moved toward a low shelf stacked with jars, each containing things better left unidentified. With a crooked fingernail, she pried the lid from one and withdrew a clump of blackened root. She threw it into the fire. Smoke turned crimson. Look, she said. In the fire, shapes writhed, mountains cracking, chains snapping. A woman with a crown of bone, her eyes weeping blood that became rivers. Above her, a moon eclipsed by a curtain of red, not shadow, blood. A crimson eclipse, Voska said. The sky will drown in her name. And when it does, nothing will burn again. Light will become myth. She does not wish to rule, she wishes to end want. What does that mean? Van asked, eyes narrowing. Desire, hope, fear, hunger, love, all will become one under her, a single eternal thirst. She will be the last thing this world ever feels. Van scowled. Then we stop the ritual, stop the cult. Voska turned to him slowly. There are no rituals left to stop. The last seal will break with choice, not by murder, not by blade, but by willing offering. The soul-marked must come of their own will. Emil paled. We've read this. The 13th. It's symbolic, isn't it? Voska's eyes flashed. You know better, Kreutzer. The professor staggered back, clutching his chest. The air had thickened, grown wet. She's marked someone, Voska continued. She's chosen them, not to die, not to bleed, but to join her. And when they say yes, the sky will open, and the eclipse will flood the world. Who? Van demanded. Voska looked at him, sorrow in her dead eyes. You already know, she whispered. Silence fell. Then she turned, sweeping a pile of bones aside to reveal a shallow basin of still water. She sliced her palm and let the blood drip into the bowl. The surface shimmered. Images formed. A child, weeping in the dark. A red-robed cultist placing a hand upon their head. A dagger, hovering in mid-air above a circle of flame, its blade whispering to the void. The Baron, grinning as black veins crept across his cheeks, speaking in a voice not his own. And behind it all a mountain that bled, Mount Narthex. She wakes, Voska said. Each dream, each death, each chant peels another layer of her prison away. You must go to the mountain. That is where she will be born again. But if we kill the cult, they are not the danger anymore, she hissed. They are the fuse. The fire is already lit. You must find the soul-marked. Stop them before they give themselves. Van swallowed. And if they already have? Voska's face darkened. Then there will be no sun tomorrow. Emil stepped forward, voice trembling. Is there a weapon? Something we can use? Voska nodded slowly. There is a blade. Yes, but it does not pierce flesh. She reached beneath her robes and withdrew a stone vial sealed with wax. This contains the tears of Valmir, distilled from the blood of a martyr whose soul resisted her in death. It can sever the bond between the soul-marked and the queen if used in time, but only if willingly taken. You cannot force it. She placed the vial in Emil's palm. It will burn like damnation itself. The soul-marked will suffer, but they will be free. Barn took a deep breath. Then we find them. As they turned to leave, Voska called out one last time. Captain, he paused. She smiled again. Be careful. You are not the only soul she's marked. Outside, the fog had turned red, and the moon was rising, swollen, veined, weeping light like fresh blood. Chapter 8. The House of Red Lanterns. The town of Velstadt lay nestled in a shallow basin of mist, its cobbled streets winding like veins through a district that pulsed with quiet corruption. From a distance, it seemed untouched by the rot spreading through the land, no burning pyres, no screams, no barricades, but as Captain Vaughn and Professor Kreutzer approached, the illusion thinned. The air was thick with perfume, and something fouler, coppery, cloying. Eyes followed them from behind shuttered windows. Laughter rose in unnatural bursts, too sharp, too perfect, and vanished the moment one tried to follow it. At the center of it all stood the House of Red Lanterns. It towered like a wound in the town's skin, 3 stories of weathered stone and crimson silk, its facade adorned with curtains that never stopped moving, even when the air was still. A red lantern burned above the arched doorway, never flickering, casting a strange, pulsating glow across the cobbles. The scent of roses soaked the street, masking the reek of old blood. Vaughn stopped 10 paces from the entrance. "This is it," Kreutzer said, his voice taut with unease. "The Codex mentioned a feeding house hidden in plain sight. The cult uses it to lure, to harvest," Vaughn finished, "and to breed loyalty." Kreutzer nodded grimly. "Blood magic is stronger when mixed with pleasure and consent. If these thralls are offering themselves freely, the bindings on the Queen's prison weaken faster." Vaughn pushed the door open without knocking. The interior was a cathedral of indulgence. The scent hid first, burning incense, crushed lilies, warm bodies. Candles lined every surface, their flames tinted red, casting sultry shadows across velvet drapes and lounging figures. Women and men reclined on silken cushions, their skin too flawless, too pale. Their eyes followed the newcomers with the languid attention of predators not yet hungry. Music trickled from unseen strings, soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat wrapped in silk. A woman approached. She was tall, regal, clad in red so deep it bled into black. Her hair cascaded like a raven's wing, and her skin gleamed like polished bone. Her lips were blood dark, her smile flawless. But her eyes betrayed her. They were ancient, burning coals buried in snow, and when she spoke, the air seemed to ripple around her. "Gentlemen," she purred, "welcome to my house. I am Lysandra. You look weary. Come, rest." Vaughn said nothing, hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. Kreutzer stepped forward instead, trying to sound casual. "We're not here for pleasure." "No?" Lysandra tilted her head. "Then perhaps for salvation?" She reached out with long, ring-clad fingers, but Vaughn stepped between them, sword half drawn. "Touch him, and I sever the hand," he said coldly. Lysandra laughed, a rich sound like wine spilling down silk. "You bring steel to a house of kisses. How crude." "You've taken villagers," Vaughn said, "and drained them. This place is a feeding den, a sanctuary," she corrected. "They come to us. We offer freedom, release. In this wretched, dying world, we give them something beautiful before the end." Emil's voice was barely a whisper. "You're accelerating the ritual." Lysandra's smile widened, just slightly. "Of course, the Queen stirs, and we welcome her." She moved like lightning. One moment, she stood 10 feet away. The next, she was on Vaughn, claws raking across his chestplate. He staggered back with a grunt, steel flashing, parrying her next strike. Her fingers screeched across the blade as she danced away, laughing. The brothel, exploded into motion. The lounging courtesans rose in unison, their eyes blazing, fangs bared. Vaughn shouted, shoving Kreutzer behind a pillar. "Find the shrine," he roared. "They'll have a blood altar break it. Kreuzherren." Vaughn turned back to Lysandra just in time to meet her strike. She fought like water, and flame fluid and ferocious, spinning through the air with inhuman grace. Her nails flashed like daggers, slicing across his forearm, drawing blood even through the mail. Vaughn countered with brute strength, hammering his blade into her ribs. She shrieked and twisted away, the wound hissing black smoke. "You bleed," he growled. "I remember pain," she whispered. "Soon you won't." Across the room, Kreutzer tore through a velvet curtain and found a hidden staircase spiraling downward. He descended into gloom, the walls lined with red wax candles and sigils carved into bone. At the bottom, he found it, a room of stone and blood. An altar stood in the center, formed from human skulls mortared together with dried gore. A basin overflowed with blood not pooled, but boiling, as if alive. Crimson veins crawled from it, pulsing along the floor toward the walls. He approached, muttering protective verses under his breath. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Too light to be human, a thrall pounced. Emil spun, swinging the codex like a bludgeon. It struck the creature's jaw with a wet crack. It shrieked and reeled, then lunged again. This time, Emil drew a shard of silvered glass from his coat, one of Voska's talismans, and drove it into the thrall's eye. The creature screamed and crumpled, convulsing as its flesh blackened. Emil turned back to the altar. He pulled a flask from his belt, the tears of Valmir. "No time to test," he muttered. He uncorked it and poured the liquid into the basin. The effect was immediate. The blood screamed. It screamed. The entire room convulsed, walls cracking, sigils bursting into flame. The veins recoiled, writhing like dying snakes. The blood boiled away in seconds, evaporating into a foul mist that reeked of death and roses. Upstairs, Lysandra staggered mid-duel, clutching her chest. Vaughn didn't hesitate. He surged forward and rammed his blade through her heart. She gasped, eyes wide, not with pain, but betrayal. "She sees you," Lysandra choked. "She knows you now." Then she crumbled to dust. The other vampires shrieked, collapsing where they stood, blood pouring from their mouths and ears as whatever link bound them to the altar was severed. Silence fell. Vaughn exhaled slowly. Kreutzer emerged, limping and pale. Blood streaked across his face. "She knows," he said, echoing Lysandra's final words. Vaughn nodded grimly. "Then we're running out of time." They left the House of Red Lanterns behind them, now silent, empty, and reeking of burnt flesh and ruined perfume. Behind shuttered windows, the townspeople watched without understanding, and above them, hidden by the clouds, the moon turned a shade darker. Chapter 9. The Tomb Beneath the Falls. The sound of the waterfall was a roar in the ears, a constant, thundering crash that swallowed words and buried thoughts. The cliffs of Varenthal, where the Blackrun River broke into 100 screaming torrents, had long been considered cursed land. Locals whispered that the water ran over the bones of the old gods. No one fished there. No one hunted near it. The falls had taken their due. Hunters, children, entire caravans vanishing into mist with no cry, no trace. But Captain Varn and Professor Kreutzer were not searching for the lost. They were searching for what had never died. By the time they reached the base of the largest fall, Vale's Mouth, as the peasants called it, the light had thinned to an iron gray, and the mist turned cold enough to bite, Vaughn's coat was soaked through. Emil's hands trembled as he unfolded a yellowing page torn from the crimson codex. The ink had bled at the edges, but the map was still legible. "It's here," Emil said, shouting over the crash of water. "Behind the third veil. There's a cavern system hidden behind the fall's mouth. The codex claims one of her resting places was entombed below this river long before the Empire ever rose." "A precaution?" Vaughn asked, scanning the churning cascade with narrowed eyes. "A sacrifice site. They buried entire villages with her," Emil replied, "to mask the tomb's aura with the blood of innocence." Vaughn grunted. "Charming." They waited for a break in the wind, then slipped behind the torrent's slick stone, ankle-deep water, blinding spray. The hidden opening revealed itself at last. A jagged fissure in the cliff face, half obscured by moss and calcified vines. Inside, it was silent, not the quiet of abandonment, but a vacuum. The sound of the waterfall stopped the instant they crossed the threshold. No echo, no dripping, no wind, just stillness. The passage descended at a steep angle, torchlight flickering over damp stone carved with unfamiliar glyphs, pre-Empire, pre-Sigma, perhaps even pre-human. The air was thick with a coppery tang, the scent of old blood and forgotten rites. After what felt like hours, the tunnel widened. They emerged into a chamber so vast it swallowed the torchlight whole. Columns of black stone reached into the gloom above, carved in the shape of twisted spines and skeletal trees. The floor was etched with concentric runes, some still glowing faintly. A low mist coiled across the ground, obscuring the ground like a burial shroud. At the chamber's heart stood a raised platform, and upon it a sarcophagus. It was not stone, it was not wood, it was bone, layer upon layer of human remains, fused by ancient magic into a twisted cradle. Chains as thick as arms coiled around it, engraved with warding sigils. Rusted spikes jutted from the sides like thorns. The lid was sealed with red wax sigils, each bearing the mark of the pale vigil. All of them were broken. Emil stepped forward, breath trembling. "The tomb of weeping echoes," he murmured. One of the 3 places the queen was divided between her essence, her hunger, her body. This, he trailed off. The sarcophagus was open. The lid, once sealed with a dozen layers of occult binding, had been shifted slightly, not shattered, moved from the inside. Vaughn raised his sword. There was no dust within, no remnants, just the faint impression of a body that had once lain in repose. Claw marks scored the interior, deep, deliberate, as though the occupant had waited, patiently, unmoving, until the time was right. "She's gone," Vaughn growled. "No," Emil whispered, stepping closer. She rose. This was not forced open. She woke. He turned to a series of wall carvings nearby, faded murals, possibly made by the same hand that built the tomb. The first showed a woman crowned in thorns, surrounded by rivers of blood. The second, her chained in a sarcophagus, guarded by monks in hoods. The third was empty. Just the mountain, the sky, the eclipse, and the people kneeling, arms open. "She was supposed to remain here," Emil said. "Part of her, at least. If this aspect her body has left, then the others can follow. The bindings were never meant to be unbroken. They relied on separation. And someone's reuniting the pieces," Vaughn said. "The cult, the Baron, that dagger." From the far end of the chamber came a low hiss. They turned. Shapes moved in the mist. Silent, pale, barefoot, Dozens of thralls emerged, men and women with empty eyes and blood-crusted mouths, clad in shrouds. Some still bore wounds that should have killed them, broken necks, eviscerated torsos, flesh peeling like rotted bark. Behind them, a figure stepped from the shadows, not masked, not veiled. A woman, regal and beautiful, her skin pale as death, her eyes black pits ringed in crimson. She wore a gown of red that never touched the floor, and her voice was the soft whisper of silk on flesh. "You have come too late," she said. Emil froze. "Lysandra," he husped. "I watched you die." The woman smiled. "You watched one part of me perish, but we are all parts, and she calls them home." Van moved without hesitation. Blade flashing, Lysandra caught it mid-swing. With her bare hand, the steel hissed. Bent, she backhanded Van across the chamber. He struck a column and crumpled to the floor, coughing blood. Emil raised the codex, but she was already upon him. "No more books," she whispered, taking his wrist. Her fingers burned. His skin bubbled beneath her grip. "No more secrets, just surrender," he screamed, and from the floor, Van rose with a howl. He hurled a silver dagger, not aimed at her but at the ceiling. It struck one of the old glyphs, a binding rune. The reaction was instantaneous. The chamber howled. Wind burst from every crack. The runes flared. The mist turned red. Lysandra shrieked, clutching her head. Van grabbed Emil, dragging him back toward the tunnel. The tomb behind them pulsed like a beating heart. Chains snapped. The sarcophagus cracked. From deep within the walls came an inhuman moan, low, guttural, ecstatic. The chamber was collapsing. They ran. The tunnel trembled with each step. Stones fell. The air became thick with dust and screaming. They burst out from the waterfall just as the cliff behind them gave a thunderous groan. Part of the mountainside crumbled, burying the entrance beneath 1,000 tons of rock. Van and Emil lay gasping beside the river, soaked and bleeding, the codex clutched between them. "She's walking," Emil said, voice ragged. "No," Van replied. "Not yet." He stared up at the crimson-streaked sky. "But she's close." Chapter 10. A Kiss from the Grave. The manse atop Geldstadt had always loomed over the village like a vulture upon a carcass. Once it had been a place of austere grandeur, a fortress manor of grim Stirland nobility, all stern stone and iron grace. But now it pulsed with red light. The windows glowed like open wounds. Music floated down the hillside, not the jovial sort, but a dirge masquerading as celebration. Strings wept, flutes moaned. The bass was a heartbeat slowed to a crawl, dragged from the chest of something ancient and unwilling to die. The masquerade had begun. Inside, the great hall had been transformed into a theater of decadence and horror. Crimson drapes hung from blackened rafters. Wax dripped from 100 candelabras like fat from butchered flesh. Blood-slick roses bloomed from human skulls. A chandelier of bones twisted slowly overhead, its candles flickering with flame the color of old wine. And the guests danced. They twirled and dipped, their movements sinuous and strange, graceful in ways that defied anatomy. Their masks were ornate, baroque visages of beasts, angels, wailing saints. But beneath the gilded porcelain, pale lips bared elongated fangs, and dead eyes gleamed behind silk veils. All around them, thralls served goblets of dark crimson. None asked what it was. All knew. Laughter rang out too perfect, too synchronized, as though the same thought had been placed in each reveler's mind at once. At the head of it all sat Baron Ekron, But he was no longer the man he once was. His face was sculpted perfection unlined, statuesque. His hair was ink dark and slicked back with perfumed oils. But his eyes were pits of darkness, red-rimmed and depthless. His smile held the calm of a corpse dressed for a funeral. He wore black and red, no armor now, but courtly garb stitched from shadow and silk, the crest of the crimson veil emblazoned on his breast. Beside him stood the high priestess of the cult, cloaked and veiled, her voice never rising above a whisper. She bore the dagger of Valther on a black velvet cushion, its blade pulsing faintly with internal light. Ekran raised a glass. "To our queen," he said, his voice resonating unnaturally, layered as though spoken by many mouths. The ballroom erupted in applause. Goblets were drained. A dozen dancers collapsed in ecstasy, tongues lolling, eyes rolled back. Beneath the floor, something stirred. Outside, Varn and Kreutzer watched from the edge of the woods. They had seen the invitations carried by carrion crows, the crimson wax sealed with the queen's sigil. They had watched villagers, what few remained, trudge up the hill in silent procession, clad in tattered finery or nothing at all, driven by hunger or madness or hope of salvation. The manse had become a shrine. "This is the final rite," Emil said, voice barely audible. "They mean to complete the blood cycle here. 13 vessels, 13 offerings, then we break it," Varn said. "How?" Emil turned, desperate. "We can't charge through a ballroom of vampires. You saw what happened at the tomb. We don't have to kill them all," Varn growled. "Just stop the ritual, destroy the blade, end the spell." Emil hesitated. "And if we fail, then we die," Varn said. "But not on our knees." They moved at dusk. The back entrance was unguarded. No one feared intrusion anymore. The cult believed itself beyond reach, cradled by prophecy and blood. That arrogance had become their shield. The interior halls were filled with thralls, servants stripped of will, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes glassy with bliss. They wandered aimlessly, offering nothing but bows to the passing shadows. The smell of blood was overwhelming, mingling with incense and rot. They passed rooms where noble women bled into chalices held by childlike creatures with hollow faces. They passed altars where still beating hearts were arranged like flower bouquets. They passed a gallery where portraits wept real blood from painted eyes. And then they reached the grand hall. It opened before them like a maw. At its center stood a stone dais, etched with spiraling runes. The high priestess stood above it, dagger held high. Below her, the 13 chosen writhed, bound in ritual chains, arranged like spokes of a wheel, mouths gagged but eyes wide. Ekran stood nearby, arms outstretched, chanting in a tongue older than man. Emil's knees buckled. "It's beginning," he gasped. "She's coming through." The runes glowed. The ground vibrated. A shriek rose, not human, not even vocal. A psychic howl reverberating through marrow. The first victim was raised. A young man barely 16, his neck bared, eyes already glazed. The priestess moved, but Varn moved faster. He burst from the shadows, blade drawn, and threw himself toward the altar. The cultists shrieked. Vampires scattered. The priestess turned just in time to see Varn's sword plunge through her abdomen. She gasped, black blood erupting from her mouth, and fell back, dropping the dagger. Emil ran forward and seized it, but the air twisted. The blade fought him. It wanted to stay. "Break it!" Varn bellowed. Emil raised it over the dais, but the blood on the altar reacted. It surged upward like a living thing, forming hands, mouths, faces. They screamed. "Don't!" Emil brought the dagger down. It shattered. The reaction was instant. The altar exploded in a geyser of black fire. The runes went white-hot. The victims screamed real screams, human, terrified. The chains snapped. The vampires shrieked, clutching their faces as the light seared them. Ekran staggered back, his perfect flesh cracking. "No," he howled. "No, she was so close." From beneath the dais, something roared, a sound not made by lungs or throat, but by raw will, and the floor caved in. The room buckled. Stone collapsed. Blood ran up the walls. Vampires burned like parchment, shrieking curses in forgotten languages. Vaughn grabbed Emil and dragged him through the chaos. They burst from the manse as it cracked apart behind them, light pouring from its windows, red, white, gold. And then the night returned. The music stopped. Silence. The man still stood, but barely. The ritual had failed, partially, because deep beneath the ruins, something stirred still, not fully awake, but no longer dreaming. A voice echoed through the ruined halls, soft as a lover's breath, cold as a crypt. "You kissed me, and still turned away." The Crimson Queen was denied, but not defeated. Chapter 11. A Noble Corruption. The carriage arrived at twilight, drawn by 2 stallions black as pitch, snorting steam that never rose. The coachman wore no livery, and had no face beneath his cowl. The carriage itself was wrought of ebony and bone, wheels turning soundlessly over the broken road that led through the ashen heaths to the smoking ruins of Geldstadt's manse. It did not stop at the village. It did not creak, or groan, or give any sign of weight, as though it moved not through the world, but around it. When it reached the scorched threshold of the manse, it halted. The door opened. From the black velvet interior stepped a tall man clad in mourning finery boots polished to a mirror shine, coat trimmed in tarnished gold, a ruby brooch set over his heart like a clot of living blood. His cane tapped lightly on the ground as he walked, though he did not limp. His hair was silver white, drawn back into a widow's tail, and his face bore the cruel serenity of noble lineage untouched by time. He was Count Adalric Valen, and he was not here for vengeance. He was here to bury an old enemy and ensure she never rose again. Inside the ruins, Van and Kreutzer still picked through the aftermath of the failed ritual. The man stood in skeletal fragments, walls scorched, floor blackened, the dais where the rite had been performed now a crater exuding low, rhythmic pulses. The dagger was gone, vaporized in the backlash. Of the cult, only bloodstains and scorched silhouettes remained. Yet the feeling of presence lingered. It clung to the air like oil. "She isn't dead," Emil said quietly. The Codex warned that if her body was restored but her essence was incomplete, the attempt would fail, partially. "She's wounded," Vaughn replied, crouching to inspect a half-melted mask. "But that means she's real. No longer a dream." The sound of the cane tapping reached them before the scent did a faint aroma of roses and crypt dust. They turned as Count Valen emerged through a curtain of smoke. He smiled politely. "You've made quite a mess," he said, voice smooth as oiled silk. "My congratulations." Vaughn stepped in front of Emil instinctively, hand going to his blade. "You're one of them," he snarled. "A leech." Varlin nodded. "Guilty as charged. But unlike the beast whose altar you destroyed, I have a sense of proportion." "Identify yourself," Emil demanded. The Count bowed. "Adalric Valen, once of Castle Guldheim, now of nowhere in particular, a descendant of noble blood before it curdled. Emil stiffened. Valen? That name is recorded in the Crimson Codex. You're a traitor to Veresa's court. Valen grinned wider. Indeed, I was her page once, later her spy master. I watched her butcher dynasties and drink rivers, and I, unlike the cultists who venerate her, had the good sense to fear her. Varn frowned. Why are you here? To ensure she stays dead. He stepped closer, the firelight playing across his pale skin. I have lived many centuries. I have served many tyrants. Vereza was the only one who looked at this world and truly wanted to end it. Not rule it, not feast from it, just silence it. Make everything hers. Forever. He leaned on his cane. I am not sentimental, but I do enjoy the world's chaos, its struggles, its filth. I drink the blood of poets and murderers alike. I dine on kings and scullions, but I need them to exist. Vereza's dream is oblivion, a kingdom of one, no voices, no hunger, no rebellion. He bared his fangs slightly. I cannot abide that. Varn did not relax. So you came to help? No, Valen said. I came to stop you from failing again. He turned to the ruins. You broke the ritual, yes, but not before she touched the world. Not before she marked it. The veil is torn, and she seeps through like rot. He pointed to the crater. She's gathering herself, even now, like blood pooling beneath a wound. If you wait, she'll rise again stronger, and next time there won't be a cult, there won't be a baron or a ball, just her, naked will, pure thirst. Emil looked ill. So, what do you propose? Valen smiled. There's a monastery, deep in the Grey Hollow Mountains, lost centuries ago, built by the Pale Vigil. It holds the Graven Mirror, an artifact older than the Queen herself, created not to kill, but to undo. It can reflect what should not exist, strip it of cohesion. Varn narrowed his eyes. Why hasn't it been used? Because it's suicidal, Valen replied. To activate it, one must stand in the Queen's presence, within reach of her mind, her essence, her kiss. Emil hesitated. And if it works? She is not banished. She is unwritten. Silence fell. Why tell us this? Varn asked. You could do it yourself. Valen's smile faded. I cannot stand before her. I carry her blood, her mark. If I enter that sanctum, she will absorb me in an instant. I can only guide you. Varn didn't trust him. He didn't want to trust him, but the Queen stirred, and they were running out of roads to walk. Take us to the monastery, Varn said. Valen nodded once. As you wish. He turned back toward the waiting carriage, and as Varn and Emil followed, the Count whispered to the night. Let the past rot in its tombs, he said. We'll see if the world is worth saving after all. Chapter 12. Children of Night. The first village died in silence. Nestled in a forgotten dell beneath the Drakewald's eastern hem, the hamlet of Dornfeld had never drawn attention. A few dozen souls lived there, farmers, woodcutters, old folk who remembered a world before taxes and war. They did not send letters, they did not ask for help, so when Dornfeld disappeared, no one noticed. The second village screamed. Althofen was a proper settlement, a church, a market, a garrison of 12 Stirland militiamen, poorly paid but proud of their swords. The blood came on the third night, thick as wine and reeking of rot. The sky had turned strange that evening, bloated clouds, low enough to touch the rooftops, the moon a pale wound. The militia lit torches, expecting beastmen. What came was worse. They came on all fours at first, hunched shapes with wiry limbs, grey skin flaking like shed bark, eyes black and lidless, naked, but for rusted chains and scraps of torn grave shrouds, their jaws unhinged like snakes, teeth jagged and irregular, tongues like meat hooks, strigoi, feral vampires. The first man they tore down was the bell ringer. By the time his screams stopped, 3 more had fallen. The militia fired crossbows to no effect. Steel slowed them, but didn't kill. Limbs removed still twitched. Severed heads still hissed. One soldier tried to flee. They found his torso nailed to the church door the next morning, eyes plucked, the word hunger carved into his ribs. Of the 40 villagers, 4 survived, 2 maimed beyond healing. The rest were drained dry or taken. Darken was worse, because those taken didn't stay gone. They came back the next night laughing. Captain Aldrich Vaughan rode hard for the Stirland border garrison. The sky overhead bled rust. Smoke rose from at least 2 directions. The horizon was a scar of burning farmsteads and empty wagons. Flocks of crows circled without cawing. Beside him rode Count Valen, composed despite the filth and fire. He barely stirred as they passed the remains of a family carriage, its horses gutted and frozen in mid-scream. A child's doll lay beside the wheel, soaked through. "They're multiplying," Valen said. "Strigoi do not sire with elegance. No blood pacts, no whispered vows, just the bite. If the host survives, the curse takes root like a tumor." Vaughn spat. "You said she was wounded. This doesn't look like weakness." "She is wounded," Valen said, "but her pain seeps into the marrow of the world. The veil is so thin, even the dumbest predators can smell the rot. The Queen's dream leaks into their minds. It makes them bolder." Vaughn growled. "And we're running out of time." They reached the garrison at dusk. It stood behind wooden palisades, manned by 20 soldiers, grim-faced, sleepless. The banners of Stirland hung limp in the still air. The commander, a gaunt woman named Sergeant Heister, met them at the gate with a musket across her lap. "We've sealed the border," she said, wasting no time. "Every road between here and the Drakwold's eastern edge is watched. No one goes in, no one comes out." Vaughn dismounted. "Too late. They've already spread past the border." "I know," Heister said. "We lost a patrol near Geppenford 2 nights ago. Not to cultists, not even vampires, just villagers, teeth filed, nails black, moving like spiders. They carved one man open and clapped." She lit a pipe with shaking hands. "We've posted kill orders on any refugee that doesn't stop when challenged. I've had to burn families. Families, Captain." Her eyes found Valen, and she stiffened. "What's that doing here?" Valen smiled faintly. That is trying to prevent the end of your species." Vaughn stepped between them. "He's a necessary evil." Heister didn't look convinced. "I've got 37 men, 10 powder charges, and a priest with half a book of Sigmar and no tongue. You'll have to make do." They camped that night behind the barricades. Fires were banned. Light drew them. So they sat in the cold, eating hard biscuit and jerky, watching the tree line. At midnight, the howling started. It wasn't wolves. It wasn't anything that belonged in this world. Long, low, vibrating howls, like the earth itself keening in grief. Soldiers clutched their muskets tighter. One pissed himself and didn't bother hiding it. Then came the scratching, soft, rhythmic, at the gates, at the walls, underneath the floorboards. Vaughn and Valen stood back to back, weapons drawn. "They're testing," Valen murmured. They remember how to siege. Somewhere in their broken skulls, the Queen's mind whispers tactics. The first breach came on the south wall. A Strigoi burst through a burning latrine, screaming. It leapt 12 feet, landing on a soldier's shoulders, tearing through helmet and skull like paper. More followed, 10, 20, rushing the barricade like a tide of meat and bone. Varn swung wide, blade flashing. The monsters fell, but didn't stay down. Even when hacked apart, their limbs crawled. One caught his ankle, digging with claws like nails from a blacksmith's shop. Varn stabbed it through the neck. It hissed, grabbed the blade, and laughed. Emil arrived with 2 flasks, alchemical fire brewed from Voska's notes. He tossed them. The flames caught. The Strigoi screamed as their skin bubbled. Fire worked. Not clean, not quickly, but it worked. By dawn, 37 men were 13. Half the garrison was ash. Heister was dead gutted from groin to chin, still clutching her musket, and the bodies of the dead twitched in the frost. We'll see them again, Varlan said. Tonight, or the night after. Emil, exhausted, slumped against a barrel. They're not just monsters anymore. They're becoming organized. They're being called, Varlan corrected. She speaks to them, even from the dream, even through stone and blood and bone. They are her children, and they're answering. Varn looked to the rising sun, pale, feeble, already receding behind red-streaked clouds. We can't hold the border. No, Varlan said. But we don't need to. The monastery lies ahead. Grey Hollow. The graven mirror. He smiled grimly. She is coming. We must meet her with something worse than hope. Chapter 13. The Crimson Mirror. The monastery of Grey Hollow did not appear so much as it revealed itself. One moment there was only scree, wind, and a sky bruised purple by the coming storm. The next, the rock face split along a seam that had never been there before, exposing stone steps descending into darkness. No sigil marked the entrance. No banner flew. It was a place designed not to be found, only remembered. Captain Aldrich Varn descended first, sword bare, every nerve screaming. Professor Emil Kreutzer followed, clutching the crimson codex to his chest as though it might crawl away if loosened. Count Varlan came last, his expression tight, eyes refusing to meet the stone walls too closely, as if the mountain itself might recognize him. The air grew colder with each step, not the cold of altitude or wind, but the kind that gnawed at thought, that made memories brittle. This place was never meant for the living, Emil whispered. Varlan gave a thin smile. Nor for the dead who refused to behave. They reached the sanctum at the mountain's heart, a circular chamber carved with brutal precision. No ornamentation, no reverence, just function. The walls were etched with the same pale vigil runes seen in the tomb beneath the falls, though here they were deeper, layered, carved again and again as if each generation had felt the need to reinforce the work of the last. At the center stood the mirror. It was tall, twice a man's height, and framed in black iron, twisted into thorned spirals. The glass itself was not reflective in the usual sense. It did not show the room, nor the figures standing before it. Instead, it shimmered with a slow, internal movement, like blood suspended in water. Emil stopped dead. The codex slipped from his fingers and struck the floor with a hollow thud. That's not possible, he murmured. Varn turned. You said it existed. I said it was destroyed, Emil whispered. Purged during the Sigmarite cleansings. Every reference claimed it was shattered, its shards scattered to prevent To prevent what? Van asked. Emil swallowed. To prevent recognition. Valen did not approach. His voice was quiet. The graven mirror does not show what you are. It shows what you were made from. The mirror pulsed. Emil felt it before he stepped forward, the tug behind the eyes, the pressure at the base of the skull, as though unseen fingers were guiding him. His feet moved without conscious command, carrying him closer. Van reached out. Emil, don't, Valen said sharply. Once it has chosen him, interference will only break him. Emil stood before the glass. At first, there was nothing. Then the surface rippled. A facey emerged, not his, a woman's, regal, terrible, beautiful in the way of storms and open graves. Her lips were stained red, her eyes, O gods, her eyes were endless wells of hunger and certainty. Vereza. Emil staggered back with a cry, but the mirror did not release him. No, he gasped. I'm not. The image shifted. The queen faded, replaced by a procession. Mortal nobles kneeling in candle-lit halls. A man with Emil's eyes, his eyes standing among them, offering a chalice filled with blood. A name echoed through the chamber, whispered by 100 mouths. Kreuzherr, Emil screamed. The mirror flared, flooding the chamber with crimson light. He saw generations unspool like butcher's twine, his ancestors bound to Vereza's court, stewards of her mortal affairs, scholars who catalogued slaughter and refined the rites that fed her ascension. He saw betrayal too, the pale vigil, infiltrated by one of his bloodline, the first witness whose name had been scratched from the codex. You were never meant to be free. The queen's voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. Your blood remembers me. Emil fell to his knees, clutching his head. No, he sobbed. I fought you. Yes, Vereza purred. And how deliciously you failed. The vision shifted again. A final image. Emil himself, older, hollow-eyed, standing willingly before her throne beneath Mount Narthex. Arms open, throat bared, the mirror went dark. Emil collapsed, retching, blood trickling from his nose. Van was at his side in an instant. Emil, speak to me. Emil looked up slowly. His eyes were rimmed red. She knows me, he whispered. Not as prey, as property. Valen finally approached, expression grim. Then the cult will hunt you now. Not to kill, to deliver. As if summoned by the words, the mountain shuddered. A horn sounded low, mournful, and impossibly close. They've found the monastery, Van growled. From the tunnels behind them came chanting, dozens of voices layered together, rising and falling in ecstatic rhythm. Red light bled through the runes in the walls as the wards strained. They shouldn't be able to enter, Emil said weakly. The vigil designed. They didn't plan for you, Valen snapped. The first cultist emerged from the passage, mask cracked, eyes blazing. More followed, thralls, vampires, mortals alike, all moving with a singular purpose. Him, run, Van roared. They fled through a side passage as the sanctum erupted in violence. Cultists tore at one another in their frenzy to reach Emil first. Vampires leapt the distance in blurs of motion. One caught Emil's coat, ripping it free, teeth snapping inches from his neck before Van split its skull. They burst from the monastery into the storm just as lightning split the sky. The cult spilled after them, screaming praises to the queen. Emil stumbled, nearly falling. Valen seized his arm with iron strength. Do not look back. If she calls you, do not answer. Why didn't you tell me? Emil cried. Valen's voice was cold. Because if you had known before the mirror, you would have already been hers. They ran until their lungs burned, and the mountain swallowed the monastery behind stone and ice. But even as they escaped, Emil felt it, a presence at the edge of his thoughts, waiting, smiling. And far away, beneath broken seals and bleeding earth, Vereza laughed softly, lovingly, having finally remembered the taste of his name. Chapter 14. A City Under Veil. Kreutzhafen had always been a city of rot, just refined enough to hide it beneath powder and polish. Nestled at the mouth of the Sterngraben River, it had once been a port of minor prosperity, known for timber, wine, and an aging cathedral whose bells had not rung since the Black Flood. But that was long ago. Now the timbers warped in the mist, the wine soured in the barrel, and the cathedral stood cloaked in birdshit and shadow. And yet it lived. Ships still docked, markets still swarmed, prostitutes still whispered beneath gas lamps, people still pretended. But Kreutzer saw it the moment they passed beneath the rusted iron gate that bore his family's name. The city was wearing a mask. The air was wrong, too sweet. The kind of scent that tried to disguise something worse, a stench of bloated corpses and sanctified rot. Fog hung low, curling around ankles like a leash. The buildings leaned too close, eaves whispering secrets to one another. Rats watched without blinking. Doors opened and closed without a sound. "Something feeds here," said Varlan as they rode through the main square, his voice barely above a murmur. "Not like the Strigoi, not animal. Something older, more patient." "They've built a nest," Kreutzer muttered, drawing his cloak tighter. "And the people have learned to be grateful for it." Indeed, the citizens of Kreutzhafen did not look afraid. They looked sedated, faces too smooth, expressions too calm. No crying children, no shouting merchants, no dogs barking. Even Varn, ever the warhound, kept his hand on the pommel of his sword the entire way through the market quarter. "What do you think?" he asked, scanning the crowd. "I think they're waiting," Varlan said, "but they no longer know what for." They made their way to the Rathaus, an old Stirland keep restructured into the city's municipal heart. The guard at the gate wore the uniform of Kreutzhafen's civic order, but the silver badge on his collar bore a different sigil, a crown pierced by a vertical fang. He let them pass without word, gaze lingering a second too long on Kreutzer. Inside, the building smelled of polish, blood, and incense. Portraits of dead mayors lined the corridors, but every canvas had been altered. Each subject now bore red irises, their painted teeth just slightly too sharp. "Cute," Von muttered. They were received in the Hall of Statutes by Mayor Halbrecht, a plump man in his 6th decade, with thin grey hair and a smile carved into his face like a festering wound. His hands were folded atop a silver-topped cane, which he never used to stand. His eyes were the worst part empty and wet, like oysters left in the sun. "Welcome," he said, rising too smoothly. "Kreutzhafen extends its open hand." Varlan gave a bow that was all mockery. "Such generosity," he said, "especially from a man who serves a queen." Halbrecht's smile did not fade. "We serve prosperity. What came before was fear, poverty, disease. What comes now is unity." Kreutzer stepped forward. "You've bound the city to the Crimson Veil." The mayor shrugged. "She offers eternal peace." "Peace?" Van spat. "You mean slavery?" Halbrecht turned slowly. "And what is freedom but the privilege to starve and die unremembered?" Van's hand shot to his sword. Varlan intervened, touching the captain's shoulder. "No," he said softly. Let me. He stepped forward, smile gone. I know you're kind, Halbrecht. You think you've bought time, that serving her will spare you, but you're just meat with manners. You'll get your reward, a throne of shit and a crown of worms. Halbrecht laughed once, and yet here you are, walking beside mortals like a tethered dog. What will your queen say when she sees you grovel before them? I hope to see her face when I cut it open, Valen replied. The room darkened, not from clouds, but from will. Halbrecht's eyes turned fully black. We'll see who kneels, he hissed. Her doors and hidden doors burst open. Guards poured in, not human anymore. Thralls, their skin grey and stretched, their mouths sewn shut save for thin-breathing slits that wheezed with excitement. They carried glaives marked with the sigil of the Crimson Veil. Varn drew steel. Time to clean house. The chamber exploded into violence. Valen moved like shadow given purpose, his cane revealing a blade of folded black steel. He cut in silence, his face blank, each stroke crippled, maimed, ended. Varn fought like a landslide brute, fast, implacable. Blood sprayed in sheets as he hacked through the first wave, boots slipping on gore. One thrall leapt for him, jaws opening unnaturally wide. Varn crushed its skull under his boot and drove his blade into the next. Kreutzer ducked behind the mayor's throne, pulling a vial from his coat, a mix of quicksilver and tears from the graven mirror. He hurled it into the face of a charging guard. It howled as its features melted, skull splitting open like an overripe fruit. Halbrecht stood motionless, watching, even as his guards died around him. When only silence remained, he turned to flee, but Valen was already there. No, the Count said. He reached forward and pressed 2 fingers to Halbrecht's forehead. Look, the mayor screamed. He fell to the ground, convulsing, eyes wide and bleeding. A scream tore from his mouth, and something left him, a black shape, indistinct, writhing in air before dissolving like ash. Halbrecht gasped. His eyes were clear for the first time in years. What did I do? He sobbed. Kreutzer stepped forward. You served a queen of blood. You gave her a city. I didn't know, the mayor cried. I thought she'd protect us. I was tired, so tired. We all are, Valen said. Then he snapped the man's neck. Varn blinked. He could have helped. No, Valen replied. He was a window. She was watching. They stepped outside. The city was silent. But now the silence was expectant. A veil lifted. People emerged from their homes, eyes wide, uncertain. The fog was lifting, but not for long. She's accelerating, Emil whispered. We're heading to the mountain, Varn said. Valen nodded. Then pray the road doesn't eat us before we arrive. Chapter 15. The Library of Dust. Beneath the bones of Kreutzhafen lay a secret older than the city itself. The streets above still whispered with unease in the wake of Mayor Halbrecht's death. The air, lighter but uneasy, like the pressure before a storm. Fog lingered in alleyways, reluctant to leave, and the people had begun speaking again, but in hushed tones, as if fearing the silence might return offended. Yet underfoot, beneath cobbles and catacombs, something waited. The Library of Dust, not a library in the traditional sense, no scholars, no windows, no light. It had been carved into the limestone by hands long dead, beneath the foundations of the original chapel, long before Kreutzhafen was ever called a city. It was said to predate the imperial calendar itself, hidden by the pale vigil in the final days of their order, sealed in rites of ash and memory. It was there the chronicle of blood had been hidden, not a book, Not quite. A relic. And now, Van, Kreutzer, and Valen descended into the forgotten dark. The entrance was buried beneath the cathedral's altar, a cracked monument where only carrion birds now gathered. Behind its defaced icon of Moor, hidden by a false wall and centuries of rot, they found the stairwell. Van led the way, torch in hand, flame flickering against slick stone. Kreutzer followed. A growing pressure behind his eyes, each step down made his skull ache. The air was thick with old sorcery, not the kind that flashed or sparked, but the slow, binding kind. Words, etched into the stone in pale vigil script, pulsed faintly with heatless light. Valen moved like a man familiar with the dark, his boots not making a sound. Why would they leave it here? Van asked. Because it couldn't be destroyed, Kreutzer muttered. Not without feeding her. They reached the threshold. The doorway was narrow, formed of bone mortared into stone femurs, ribs, skulls. The arch was etched with a warning. He who seeks to unwrite must first be unwritten. Beyond it lay a vast chamber that defied geometry. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the walls stretched away into angles that bent logic. Shelves spiraled like ribs from a central dais. The floor was not stone, but dust, thick, grey, choking. Not the dust of decay, the dust of burned books, of knowledge condemned and ash-etched. The air buzzed. Kreutzer could barely stand. This is not a library, he said. It's a sarcophagus. Valen pointed to the center. There, hovering inches above a pedestal, was the chronicle. It was not bound. It floated, a coil of sinew and flesh, pages stitched from skin, inked in a substance that shimmered like old blood and mercury. Words moved across its surface, rearranging themselves as if reacting to presence. The book watched them. Van didn't move. What is that thing? Kreutzer stepped forward, unable to resist. He reached out. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, the world shifted. The library dissolved into shadow. He stood alone, in a void. A voice spoke not in sound, but in thought, a chorus of one. We bound her not with chains, but with truth. Images exploded behind his eyes. Veresa, before the name, before the throne, was not born undead. She was made, a child of a cursed bloodline, raised in a temple deep within the Black Gulf, chosen by a sect of necromancers seeking to birth a god of hunger. She was fed the marrow of 1,000 saints. She drank the dreams of priests. Her soul was broken and reforged until it knew no want but dominion. But even then, she was incomplete. She stole the last part, a pact made with something beneath the world, a thing with no name that breathed through stones and drank centuries. In exchange for its power, Veresa offered herself as conduit. She would be its voice, its avatar, its hunger. The bindings came centuries later, not to kill her. They couldn't. Instead, they wrote a lie so powerful it rewrote her reality. They made the world forget her, erased her name from records, severed her myth from memory. They turned her into a story, and stories could be contained. That lie was the chronicle. It pulsed in Emil's hands now, and he felt it peeling him apart. Every ancestor, every memory, every moment that tied his bloodline to hers bloomed in awful clarity. The Kreutzers had not merely served her, they had loved her. A family bound in admiration and worship, turned to record-keepers, then to betrayers. One ancestor had even stood among the pale vigil, whispering secrets in both directions, a bridge between the queen and her wardens. And now Emil carried that contradiction in his blood. When the vision ended, He collapsed to the floor, weeping blood from his nose and ears. Van caught him, eyes wide. "Emil? I saw it," he gasped. "I saw her rise, and fall, and rise again. I saw the truth." Valen knelt beside them. "What does it say?" Emil's voice shook. "She was made from lies, but the moment the last of those lies dies, she becomes real, fully, permanently. No banishment, no seals." Van's jaw tightened. "So if this book is read, she returns, fully formed?" Valen raised an eyebrow. "Then we burn it." "No," Emil snapped. "That's what she wants. The book is a cage. It contains her by containing the truth. If it burns, that truth is freed." Silence. "Then we guard it?" Van asked. Kreutzer looked at the chronicle, still pulsing, still watching. "No," he said. "We use it." Valen stood slowly. "Explain." "We take it to the mountain," Emil said, "to the place of her body. We read the chronicle in reverse. We rewrite the lie, make the world forget her again. But deeper, sharper. We seal her not just in stone or myth, but in non-memory." Vaughn looked grim. "And the cost?" Emil looked up, eyes rimmed red. "Someone must be the vessel. The lie must be anchored to flesh." "You," Valen said flatly. Emil nodded. "She marked me. My blood is tied to hers. I am her echo. If I carry the lie, it will hold." Vaughn looked away. "You'll die." "Worse," Emil whispered. "I'll be forgotten, even by you." Vaughn said nothing. He just helped him to his feet. "Then let's make it count," he said. They turned to leave. But outside, deep beneath the catacombs, something stirred. The Queen had felt it, and she was no longer content to dream. Chapter 16. Red Rain. The blood fell where the world was thinnest. It spilled not upon stone or soil, but upon meaning, upon the final place where lies were still holding reality together by their fingernails. Mount Narthex shuddered as the first drop struck, a tremor rolling outward through roots, rock, and bone. Somewhere deep beneath the mountain, something that had waited for centuries exhaled. Professor Emil Kreutzer screamed. The cut had been shallow. It was meant to be. A scholar's incision, not an executioner's stroke. The ritual demanded only blood freely given, bound to memory and lineage. Emil had insisted upon it, had taken the blade from Vaughn's hand himself and opened his palm over the ritual circle, carved into the ancient stone. But the mountain did not care for intention. The blood did not drip. It leapt. It tore itself from Emil's veins in twisting red filaments, spiraling downward into the glyphs etched into the stone like starving serpents. The runes ignited, blazing with a crimson light so intense it cast shadows upward, bending gravity and sense alike. Valen staggered back, hissing as the wards fled. "Too much," he snarled. "This is not a key, this is a coronation." Van lunged for Emil, but the air between them turned solid. He struck it like glass, his gauntlet cracking, pain flaring up his arm. "Emil!" he roared. The scholar convulsed, eyes rolled back, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream as memory was torn from him. His bloodline, his ancestors' worship, betrayal, love, and fear was being consumed. Not drained, understood. The mountain split. A sound rolled out that was not sound at all, a pressure wave of pure intent that flattened trees, shattered old watchtowers, and sent avalanches screaming down the slopes. Birds burst from the canopy in clouds of black feathers, then fell dead mid-air. Their hearts ruptured, and then she rose. Vereza did not emerge screaming. She did not claw her way upward like a beast. She stood. Stone flowed away from her body as though ashamed to touch her. Chains dissolved into ash. Sigils cracked and screamed as they were undone, not broken, but dismissed. The coffin of bone that had once bound her collapsed inward, crushed by the certainty of her existence. She was taller than any mortal woman, her form sculpted in impossible elegance. Her skin was pale as moonlit marble, shot through with veins that glowed faintly red, pulsing to a rhythm not bound to a heart. Her hair flowed freely, black and heavy, moving as if under water. A crown of dark iron and thorned bone settled itself upon her brow, grown rather than placed. Her eyes opened. The world knelt. Not physically, not yet, but in the way a throat tightens when a blade is drawn near, in the way breath catches when prey realizes the hunter is already behind it. Faiza inhalet. Every living thing within 10 leagues felt it. Men collapsed, clutching their chests. Animals froze mid-step. The strigoi howling through the forests fell silent, then turned as one, eyes rolling back in bliss. "Yes," she whispered. Her voice did not echo. It arrived inside skulls, inside marrow, inside the spaces where fear is born. "After so long, you remember how to bleed, is it?" Emil sagged, blood pouring freely now, his body emptied like a husk. Vaughn struck the barrier again and again, screaming himself hoarse as Valen watched with teeth bared in fury and awe. "She's awake," the Count breathed. "Fully, entirely." Vereza turned her gaze upon Emil. "Ah," she said softly. "My historian, my shadow, my forgotten son." She reached out. The barrier vanished. Vaughn surged forward, but too late. Vereza's fingers brushed Emil's brow. He did not scream this time. He said. Blood flowed upward, not spilling, not falling, drawn from every pore, every wound, every memory-bound vein. It wrapped around her wrist like a lover's caress before sinking into her skin. Emil's body crumpled to the stone. Empty. Vereza straightened. The mountain howled, and then she smiled. The Stirland border camps died before they understood they were under attack. The night was clear, too clear. No fog, no warning. The sentries joked nervously about the calm, gripping muskets slick with sweat as the moon hung swollen and red above the tree line. Then the ground moved. Not tremors, footsteps, thousands of them. From the forest poured the children of night strigoi in packs, cultists chanting as they ran, vampires in courtly armor astride skeletal steeds that did not touch the ground. The sky darkened as bats swarmed in choking clouds, blotting out stars. The first alarm bell rang once. Then the tower fell. Vereza walked at the center of it all, unhurried, her bare feet never touching the soil. Where she passed, torches guttered and died. Powder went damp in barrels. Prayers curdled on lips. Cannon fired. The shot vanished mid-air, collapsing into rust. Men charged. They died screaming, bodies bursting as their blood was torn free in wet red spirals that fed the Queen's passing. She did not look at them. She did not need to. Stirland's line broke in minutes. Veterans fled. Officers wept. One priest raised the twin-tailed comet and cried Sigmar's name until his jaw unhinged and his eyes boiled. Vereza raised a hand. The earth split. A wall of blood erupted from the soil, every corpse ever buried in that ground disgorging its stolen life in a single obscene tide. It washed over the camp, drowning men where they stood, filling lungs, eyes, souls. When it receded, nothing stood. Not a tent, not a banner, only bones. Miles away, The city bells of Kreutzhafen rang not by mortal hand, but by command. Every vampire in hiding answered the call. Every thrall dropped to their knees in rapture. The cultists wept openly, carving her name into their own flesh, and high upon Mount Narthex, Vaughn knelt beside Emil's body, shaking. "She used him," he whispered. "She used him." Valen said nothing. He watched the horizon burn red as Varesa's reign began, the Red Rain, and the world, battered and bleeding, finally understood what it meant to be prey. Chapter 17. The Battle at Broken Hill. They called it Broken Hill because no name could ever make it sound livable. The old Stirland fort crouched atop a barren rise like a wounded sentinel, stone walls cracked and worn by centuries of wind and frost. Soldiers had once drilled in its courtyard. Militia had once stood watch from its ramparts. Now it was little more than ruins, and a symbol standing between the last handful of free men and the night that sought to devour them whole. Captain Aldrich Vaughn surveyed the shattered battlements as the blood moon rose, its crimson glow spilling over the desolate plains. The sky looked as though it were bleeding from the inside, an omen, the old priests would have said. But the gods were dead, or deaf, or both, and here the living stood alone. "Listen," Vaughn murmured to the ragged company arrayed behind him, stirring figures wrapped in patched cloaks, wielding rusted halberds and cracked shields. Many were farmers pressed into service, survivors of villages that had swallowed Strigoi like locusts, their eyes glazed with exhaustion and terror. A handful were Stirland regulars, grim-faced men with fresh scars and older fears. The wind was dead. Only silence filled the night. Emil Kreutzer had fallen before Broken Hill, not in battle, but by the unmaking of himself, his blood drained into the waking of a thing no scholar should ever see. Valen, the corrupted noble who had once walked with them, had vanished days ago in a mist of iron and whispered curses. Vaughn did not mourn them. Not here. Not yet. "Captain," said Sergeant Harkin, a burly veteran whose beard was grey and caked with soot, "we've heard them, Northridge. Something's moving." Vaughn closed his eyes, drawing in the barren air. The scent wasn't wind or dust. It was blood. Metallic, warm, predatory. "They're coming," he said. The first wave struck, with no herald but scream. Not human screams. A tapestry of howls torn between hunger and exultation. The Strigoi swarmed over the hill like a living stain, twisting corpses bound with fast muscle and malice, eyes blazing with unnatural hunger. Their bodies were gaunt, sinew drawn tight over bone, claws elongated like razors. Some moved on all fours, loping in a blur. Others stood tall, skeletal limbs cracking and flexing as they closed in. Behind them came something worse, the hunters. Vampires clad in leather armor, faces half-shadowed, laughter slipping from whisker-thin lips. Their mounts were no steeds of flesh and bone, but creatures stitched from nightmares, skeletal horses with glowing eyes, joints that popped like knuckles cracking, limbs that didn't obey the laws of balance or grace. The first clash was chaos. Strigoi slammed into the makeshift palisade with such force splinters flew like shards of glass. Men screamed as hands clawed through the gaps, ripping and tearing at ankles, bellies, throats. One farmer, barely 16, had his guts yanked free by a feral hand and used them like ropes to strangle the man beside him before both fell into the blood-soaked dirt. Sergeant Harkin bellowed a command that dissolved into a roar of panic. Men fired their muskets, but the shots hammered into Strigoi like pebbles against iron. One vampire hunter in the rear line fired a brace of pistols before falling with a blow that severed his spine at a single strike. Van did not waste a breath. He drove forward through the slaughter, blades singing as it arced through bodies. His boot slipped in blood, crushed bone, sodden earth. He fought without hesitation, a whirlwind of steel and fury. One Strigoi leapt, claws extended. Van met it mid-air, drove his blade through its chest, felt the bone snap like reed in a storm. The creature did not die. It exploded. Black ichor sprayed like rain, and still it flailed, its severed limbs crawling toward Van with unspeakable intent. A vampire hunter, a woman whose face was more scar than flesh, slammed into Van's shoulder, knocking him sideways. She snarled and struck at his throat, but Van spun, countered, and drove her back. Her armor was thick, but her eyes were empty, the signet of the crimson veil carved into her brow in blood-red ink. "No mercy," she hissed. "No surrender," Van growled back. Their blades met in a twinned flash. Behind him, the battle flared like hellstorm lightning. The moon cast grotesque shadows, elongated limbs, and screaming faces fractured by firelight. A line of militia stood shoulder to shoulder, shielding a wounded priest as he chanted a prayer, half-remembered and devoid of faith. The priest's voice cracked. "Sanctus, Sanctus, Hefel." Something in the night howled, higher and deeper than any creature's cry, a sound that clawed at memory and buried it. Van caught his breath long enough to see them, the mounted vampires, circling, eyes like cold lamps scanning the battlefield. There were 10 of them, no 12, and at their helm riding a steed of midnight bones, mane flowing like a funeral veil, was a figure that made Van's blood turn to ice, tall, poised, cloaked in black that drank the moonlight, and beneath the hood eyes that shone with the lust of ages. She did not speak, she simply looked. Every man on Broken Hill felt it, the weight of her gaze like a blade against the throat. Van squared his shoulders. "Stand," he roared. "For Stirland, for the living." But the men before him faltered. Every shield raised was a trembling thing. Every sword held was half-drawn, hands shaking so violently the metal rattled like dying bells. The mounted figure lifted a hand. At once, the Strigoi stopped, not because they were commanded, because they heard her. Their howls died. Their snarling jaws slackened. Heads tilted toward the blood moon, as though answering a summons older than fear. Silence. Not peace. Suspense. Then the figure dismounted, each step measured, each movement tracing inevitability. Her cloak parted. Silver moonlight raced across her skin, a woman untouched by time. Tall, regal, arms wrapped in crimson-braided cords. Her hair was blacker than the void, cascading in heavy waves. Her eyes burned like twin embers set in snow. Van stood firm. "Show yourself," he bellowed, voice cracking in the cold wind. She did not answer. She walked forward. Each footstep seemed to unmake the ground, a little crack here, a bone fragment there, as if the earth itself feared her. The militia wavered. One of them screamed, not in pain, not in fear, but in joy, and lunged forward, blade raised to strike anything. A Strigoi tore him apart mid-laugh. The thing's claws plunged into the militiaman's back like freezing iron, then yanked him over, heart still beating, mouth still screaming. Van's stomach churned. The figure paused before him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel. Time slowed. Her voice was low, ancient. What is a fortress but a whisper of hope in a dying world? Van's fists clenched. "I'm no poet." Her lips curved in a sad, bloodless smile. Hope is a blade easily broken. Behind her, the Strigoi advanced, not running, not with the haste of monsters. They glided silent, sure, inevitable. Van roared half a scream. half a curse and charged. Blade sang death again. He cut a swath, a wide, terrible arc, severing heads, spilling ichor, burying steel in bone. But the numbers did not thin. For every strigoi felled, 2 more took its place. The ground itself seemed to pulse with them rising from the earth like crawling rot. Varn fought until his arms burned, and his heart staggered. Then he saw it. The mounted figure atop her skeletal steed once more, a spear of black iron in hand, brilliance of the blood moon reflecting like fire across its edge. She thrust, not at him, at the very fabric of the line. The spear struck the earth, and the world cracked. A shock wave tore through Broken Hill, hurling men like rag dolls, smashing bone and armor, as though they were toys broken by giants. When the dust cleared, Varn was on his belly, ears ringing, blood in his mouth. The dead and dying lay everywhere, crimson soaking soil and frost alike. He pushed himself up. Only a handful remained. Sergeant Harkin, the silent priest, a farm boy gripping a broken spear as though it might be a prayer, and above them all she stood. The blood moon framed her, like a coronation, like a promise, like the last dominion of all things that must feed. The wind moaned, and Broken Hill fell. Chapter 18. The Pact of Pale Fire. The night air over the grey hollow foothills was colder than any winter wind Aldrich Varn had ever known. It cut through the layers on his back like a whetstone edge-slicing cloth. Each breath stung, frosted his beard, and churned his guts with longing for warmth and indulgence he could not afford. Beneath his boots, the frost-cracked earth trembled under the ceaseless moaning of wind, and something darker, something that seemed to breathe, waiting. Captain Varn did not like winter. He despised it. Not because the cold was hard on flesh, he had bled through colder dawns in far crueler wars, but because winter mirrored this moment, ruthless, unrelenting, and devoid of mercy. The world had gone mad, and here he stood, once again at its edge, staring into a void of ice and blood. Beside him, Count Adalric Valen walked with an ease that betrayed centuries of death. His boots barely made sound on the frozen soil. His expression was veiled, unreadable, more practiced than most men's faces after a lifetime of masks and subterfuge. The Count had come back for them, though Varn wasn't sure whether to accept that as salvation or a blade in the ribs waiting to be twisted. Between them walked the silent husk of a third, a fallen remnant, reciting prayers in a tongue that hadn't been spoken since the age of legends. Madame Voska, hedge witch of Draken Hollow, led them without doubt, though her steps were slow and painful. The fog hung around her like a shroud, clinging to her linen and hair, as though it knew she was dying. "It burns," she murmured, fingers clutching a staff carved with wards older than the kingdom of Sackland. Her eyes, milky with age and insight, looked up at the moon, pale, sickly, and so very close to its crimson twin. "The path is fire and ash and no mercy." Varn almost spoke, almost said that there never was mercy if they hoped to stop Veresa, but then an icy wind tore at his cloak and carried Voska's words away. She didn't need to repeat them. They all knew. Beneath Grey Hollow there awaited a forge older than kingdoms, a crucible called the Pale Fire. It was said to be the dying breath of a god cast down. It was here that Voska intended to bless the dagger of Volthur, the only relic known in all the ages rumored, powerful enough to harm Veresa, truly harm her. But such an act demanded sacrifice, and Voska's frail body had long been curling toward dust like dead parchment. They reached the cavern's maw, the entrance marked by frost-rimed monoliths hewn with runes that pulsed like dying hearts. Varn's sword sliced through the cold fog. "Is this really going to work?" he asked, voice as rough as gravel dragged across iron. Varlin didn't look back. "It must. If the dagger is blessed here, at the pale fire, it will be able to cleave the bonds she wove around her immortality. Without that blessing, we stab shadows." "That's assuming we make it back alive," Varn said. They descended, deeper, colder. The air grew heavy, thick with ancient magic, and a smell like copper left to rot in a corpse's mouth. Varn felt it in his bones. The caverns weren't dead, they were hungry. The walls exhaled as they walked, as though digesting their presence. At last they came upon the chamber of pale fire itself, not a flame, not a spark, but a maelstrom of light and heat and noise that defied logic. A sphere of white-hot energy hovered above a pool of volcanic glass. It was like staring into a star's memory, brilliant, chaotic, alive. Voska knelt before it. Her skin was so pale it seemed translucent. Her breath came raggedly, as though the very act of life was an enemy to her. Varn watched as she unfolded the dagger of Valther before the fire-black steel veined with the crimson of old enchantments, its edge impossibly sharp, hungry for violence. "Bless it," she whispered, "not with hope or holiness, but with truth, with the fire that burns lies to ash." The cave tremored. Varlin stepped close. "Be careful," he murmured. "The pale fire answers only what is true. It will not grant strength. It will reveal weakness." Voska's eyes drifted closed. A beat of silence, thick as blood pooling in dead lungs, and then she plunged the dagger's tip into her own chest, not in slowness, not in hesitation. The blade slid through flesh like water. Varn's cry echoed not of fear, but horror. Voska did not flinch. Her blood welled around the blade, and when the pale fire saw the first bead of crimson drip, it roared. Light poured outward in blinding arcs, scorching the cavern, turning rock to steam. Voska's scream cut through it, a twisting, keening refrain that rose in harmony with the tumbling fire until the pale fire accepted the offering. The dagger glowed first red, then white, then a harsh brilliance that matched the sphere above the pool. Veins of light wrapped the blade, searing the air around it. Voska fell back, her life bleeding not just from her wound, but from the act itself. Her breath rattled, a dying wind in a broken world. Varn staggered toward her, but Varlin stopped him. "Don't," the Count said. "She chose this." Voska's eyes, once opaque, were clear, now alive and sharp, glittering with terrible illumination. "Take it," she whispered, voice thin like cobweb, yet stronger than the wind outside. "It is done. Use it well, and remember truth cuts both ways." Varn bent and slipped the blessed dagger into his belt. The metal hummed quietly, dangerously, like a heartbeat in a tomb. Voska exhaled once, and then she was still. Varlin drew a cloth and covered her eyes. "A true death," he said softly, "the kind that speaks louder than life ever did." They left the cavern. Above, the moon had turned fuller, deeper red. Not just a blood moon, but a moon that bled. The world was listening, and Vereza, she was coming. They arrived at the ruins of Broken Hill as the sun bled its last light from the west. The field was a wasteland of shattered shields, rusted halberds, splintered wood, and the bones of the fallen. The wind howled through empty helmets like a funeral dirge. No birds sang here, no insects crawled, only the dead watched with hollow sockets. Varn stepped over a shattered shield, his gaze distant, thoughts heavy. Voska saw something in that fire, he murmured. Truth that needed burning. Varlin's eyes were dark, unreadable. Truth often leads to ruin. Sometimes that's necessary. They set up what remained of their fallen defenses, 36 soldiers who had not yet fled or died. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, but there was steel in those eyes, steel grit that would not be broken without bone. The night was close now, and with it came the cries, not distant howls, not merchant servants fleeing into the dark, but drums, deep, echoing, and step by step, wave upon wave, the army of the night marched. First the thralls, former villagers with vacant smiles and blackened veins, then the cultists' robes stained with old blood, chanting with fervor that bordered on ecstasy. Then the Strigoi, more now than Varn had ever seen, moving with terrible coordination, hungrier, faster, crueler, and then, above the din, atop the rise, she, Vereza, stood on broken hill, no throne beneath her, no altar, no rituals, just power incarnate. She held the moon in her gaze, her hair flowed like liquid night, her lips parted not to speak, but to smile, a smile that tasted of eternity and hunger. And Varn saw the blade at his side, once a cursed dagger, now blessed by fire, older than gods. He drew it. The metal felt like truth in his hand, cold, unflinching, merciless. Varlin stood to his right, cane in hand, eyes like ice. Behind them, the soldiers braced. Vernon, the last priest among them, whispered a prayer that had been forgotten in most tongues. Sanctus imploro. But there was no peace left in words. There was only battle, and under the blood moon, the final stand began. Chapter 19. The Crimson Eclipse. The sky tore itself open, not with thunder, not with fire, but with a slow, obscene inevitability, as if the heavens themselves had been waiting for permission to die. The moon slid across the sun like a clot over an eye, and the world dimmed to a bruised twilight that bled red at the edges. Stars winked out one by one, snuffed like candles pinched between bloody fingers. The Crimson Eclipse had begun. Mount Narthex loomed beneath the dying sky, its broken crown wreathed in spirals of blood mist and ash. Rivers of red light flowed up its slopes instead of down, drawn toward the summit where the old prison had collapsed into a wound in the world. Every sigil carved there now burned inside out, their warding meanings inverted, their purpose devoured. And at the heart of it all stood Vereza. She was no longer merely awake, she was ascending. The air around her shimmered and warped, space itself bending in obeisance. Her body glowed from within, veins blazing like molten gold beneath alabaster skin. The crown upon her brow had grown bone elongating, iron flowering outward into a halo of thorns and jagged arcs that crackled with stolen power. Shadows knelt at her feet. Sound fled from her presence, swallowed whole. Around the summit, the cult of the Crimson Veil screamed in rapture. They carved themselves open, throats, bellies, palms, letting their blood rise in spiraling columns that fed into the vast sigil carved into the mountain top. Thralls collapsed, empty husks, their life drawn out through their eyes and mouths in red streams. Strigoi prowled the perimeter, snarling and fighting one another for scraps of discarded flesh, their hunger sharpened to madness by her proximity. Captain Aldrich Varn stood at the edge of the slaughter, boots slick with blood, lungs burning. He had lost count of the dead. Men he had commanded, men he had sworn to protect, Men who had stood beside him at Broken Hill and died screaming under a red moon. Their bones now littered the path behind him, trampled into the earth by the cult's frenzy. Varlin fought at his side, no longer hiding what he was. The Count had shed his mortal restraint like a torn cloak. His eyes burned silver white, fangs bared, movements blindingly fast. He carved through cultists and feral vampires alike, black blade singing as it took heads, arms, spines. Blood sprayed in sheets, but he did not feed. He did not slow. "She's almost there," Varlin shouted over the roar of the ritual. "The Eclipse is the final bridge when the sun dies. She crosses." Varn's hand went to his belt. The dagger of Valthur thrummed there, vibrating like a living thing. Pale fire still clung to it, an after-image that burned the eyes to look upon too long. Voska's sacrifice echoed in its edge, a truth sharpened to violence. "She bleeds," Varn growled. "Then she dies." They charged. The ground resisted them, flesh and stone merging into something half alive that tried to drag them down. Hands formed from mud and blood, clutching at ankles. Varn hacked them apart, each strike splattering gore that evaporated before it hit the ground. A wall of force slammed into them halfway up the slope. Varlin flew backward like a broken doll, smashing into a standing stone with a wet crack. He did not rise. Varn staggered, knees buckling, vision swimming as the pressure crushed the air from his lungs. He tasted iron, felt his ribs creak. Vereza turned. Her eyes locked onto him, and she smiled. "Still standing," she said, her voice no longer merely sound but command. "How charming." She lifted one hand. Varn felt his blood answer. It surged toward her, trying to tear itself free from his veins. His heart stuttered, pain exploding through his chest as crimson threads began to rise from his skin like smoke. He screamed and dropped to one knee. "Enough," Vereza said softly. "You are brave, little soldier, but bravery is only meat with conviction." She drew his blood into herself, savoring it, eyes half-lidding in pleasure. Then she stiffened. Something else touched her senses, a presence she knew, a taste she remembered. "Impossible," she murmured. Behind her, staggering through the carnage, came Emil Kreutzer. He should not have been alive. His skin was grey, stretched tight over bone. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with black, veins standing out like inked lines. Blood soaked his chest and side where her awakening had hollowed him out. But still he walked, each step an act of raw defiance. The chronicle of blood was gone, burned, absorbed, written. Varn's breath caught. Emil Kreutzer did not look at him. His eyes were fixed on Vereza. "You used me," he said, voice cracked but steady. "You drank my blood, my history, my family's lies." Vereza laughed, a sound that made the mountain tremble. "And I would do it again," she said. "You were born for me, a vessel, a bridge. You should be grateful." Kreutzer reached into his coat and drew the dagger. The dagger of Valthur blazed white-hot in his hand, pale fire roaring to life as it sensed her. The air screamed around it. The sigil beneath their feet faltered, lines flickering. Vereha's smile faltered. "Put that down," she said, not command, but warning. "You can't stop this," Kreutzer replied. "But I can scar you." He ran. The world seemed to slow. Cultists lunged for him, only to burst apart as the dagger's aura tore them from existence. Blood evaporated mid-air. Flesh unraveled into ash. Vereza raised both hands now, her power slamming into him like a tidal wave. Kreutzer flew backward, but he twisted mid-fall, landing hard, bones cracking, breath bursting from his lungs. He rolled to his knees and kept going. Vereza shrieked as the dagger struck her ward. The pale fire tore through her defenses like dry parchment. Her blood divine now, terrible and radiant, spilled free, hissing as it hit the ground. The sigil cracked, lines shattering outward. "No!" she roared. "You belong to me!" Kreutzer slammed the dagger into her chest. Time broke. Light exploded outward in a sphere of white and crimson, the eclipse above stuttering as though the sun itself recoiled. Vereza screamed not in pain, but in loss. Power ripped away from her in howling torrents, spilling into the sky, the earth, the screaming dead below. Kreutzer was lifted off his feet, impaled upon the dagger still buried in her heart. Blood poured from his mouth. Varn dragged himself forward, screaming his name, clawing at the ground as the shockwave flung him aside again and again. Vereza clutched Kreutzer to her, nails digging into his back. "You could have been eternal," she hissed. "You could have ruled beside me." Kreutzer smiled weakly, blood running down his chin. "I was always just a footnote." He twisted the dagger. Vereza howled. The eclipse shuddered. The red light dimmed. The sigil imploded, consuming cultists, thralls, Strigoi alike in a vortex of annihilation. Kreutzer collapsed. Vereza staggered back, clutching her chest, blood pouring through her fingers, her ascension violently arrested. She screamed defiance at the sky, at the dying eclipse, at the world that refused to end. Varn reached Emil at last, dropping to his knees beside him. "Stay with me," he begged. "Don't you dare." Emil's eyes were already glazing. "She's wounded," he whispered. "Not dead. Never dead." He coughed, red bubbling at his lips. "But she'll remember this." Varn squeezed his hand, tears cutting tracks through blood and grime. "You did it," he said hoarsely. "You stopped her." Emil shook his head faintly. Delay it here." The eclipse passed. The sun bled back into the sky, and Vereza, screaming, broken, furious, was dragged screaming into shadow by forces no mortal could see, her near godhood torn from her grasp. The mountain began to collapse. Varn lifted Kreutzer's body as the summit fell apart, ash and stone raining down around them. Behind them, the age ended. But the night was not finished yet. Chapter 20. Dust to dust. The wind tasted of ash and ruin. Broken rock and shattered stone littered the summit of Mount Narthex, where once Vereza had stood triumphant beneath a bleeding sky. Now the ridge was a graveyard craters where her wrath had rent the earth, spires of blackened stone jutting into a grey sky, like the ribs of some colossal, forgotten beast. The air was choked with dust so fine it slipped into lungs like silent killers, lodging in the deepest recesses, reminding every living thing that survived this horror that the world was not kind, nor was it forgiving. Captain Aldrich Varn stumbled forward through the ruin, his coat torn, flesh scorched, and breath a raw rasp that sounded to him like breaking bones. Every step was agony, every breath was fire. The mountain beneath his boots groaned, as though weary of all that had transpired here. The sky above was a sickly copper, clouds swirling low, wind whispering like lost souls. This was the aftermath of apocalypse, barely averted so near the edge that even the stones carried the stink of brimstone and blood. At the heart of the ruin stood the broken remnant of the sigil that had once been Vereza's altar. The runes carved into the bedrock were cracked, splintered, some shards still glowing faintly with the last echo of pale fire. The air near them hummed, not with magic, but with exhaustion. A seal had been forced back into place, welded shut with the price of far too much violence. Vaughn knew, deep in his marrow, that it had been sealed for now, barely sealed. Behind him, half buried in rubble and frost, was the body of Emil Kreutzer, lifeless, pale as bone. The codex he had carried, what remained of it, was scattered in singed pages at his feet. Vaughn couldn't bring himself to push the body more than once each time he tried. A flicker ran across Emil's features, like the dying pulse of a spent mind. He was gone. The captain knelt, eyes stinging with exhaustion and something closer to sorrow than he had allowed himself in years. "Rest, Emil," he whispered. "Your war is done." Cold. That was the word he felt pressed into his bones as he looked out over the shattered world, cold, empty, and aching. The silence was not peaceful. It was not resolution. It was the silence of something that should have died long ago but did not die gently. Vaughn rose at last, breath trembling in his chest like a last storm. He could feel every wound in his body, splintered ribs, his left arm hanging at an awkward angle, deep gouges across his legs and back. Each breath brought fire into his lungs. But someone had to stand. Someone had to bear witness to all this ruin. That someone was him. He limped down the slope, carrying his sword now dull and etched with the dust of broken earth, and he did not look back. The descent was a crawl through mist and shattered terrain. Days, or what felt like days, passed in a blur of pain and memory. Vaughn lost count of time, lost count of hunger, lost count of the dead faces in his mind. The wind seemed to whisper at his heels, sometimes like voices he once knew, other times like something older and hungrier. He wandered until he reached no man's land, the border where Stirland met nothingness. There, night had become a living thing. Crows observed him with unblinking eyes. Wolves howled in places where wolves should not be, and still he walked. He reached a road cracked, overgrown, and stained with the rust of centuries. Towns lay abandoned. Smoke curled from hearths abandoned in fear, soot and ruin marking where life had once attempted to flourish. No priest sang. No bells tolled. No laughter echoed in the streets. Only the wind. Only dust. Only ruin. Vaughn did not stop. He walked until the stars looked wrong, until the moon was a pale scar in the sky, until his wounds festered and his mind teetered on the edge of despair and madness. And then he disappeared. No tavern knew him. No village claimed him. No one saw the captain with the empty eyes shuffle past in the dead of night. If anyone noticed, but they rarely did, he was just another ghost passing through, a wounded veteran among countless others, a man with no kingdom left to defend, a soldier with nothing but the taste of dust in his mouth. Far from the broken peak of Narthex, deep in the crumbling heart of a forgotten village, not far from where the first disappearances had begun, something stirred, not living, not dead, but waiting. In the basement beneath the old inn, in a room that had once been used for storing barrels of wine and salted pork, a group gathered in shadows. They were not soldiers, not scholars, not villagers with the terror-driven obedience of the cultists who had worshipped Vereza. No, these were the new believers. They whispered of the Crimson Eclipse not as a threat, but as inevitability. Their voices were low, garbed in robes of black and red, masks half-formed of bone and rusted wire. The youngest among them could barely grow a beard. The oldest's face was lined with years of whispers and fevered dreams. "Today we remember," said the one at the head, a slender man whose breath misted against the cold stone floor. His eyes were bright with fervor. "Today we pledge ourselves to what must come again." Another knelt before a crude altar, An upturned table, blackened by candle soot and carved with sigils that had once been buried beneath Narthex's ruins. On it lay a bowl of dark liquid wine, blood. Neither could be certain by the scent, but it shimmered red in the lamplight, pale fire flickering in its depths. "Vereza sleeps beneath the mountain," the slender man continued. "Her essence flows like wine in the veins of the world. The eclipse was but a taste. The next will be full, and when it opens, when the moon bleeds once more, we shall rise with her and feast upon the bones of the weak." The others murmured in agreement, hands raised, voices rising in unholy cadence. "Blood reborn, moon reborn, queen reborn." The lamplight flickered, the shadows writhed, the wind outside howled its approval, and somewhere on a lonely road far from here, Captain Aldrich Vaughn walked into the darkness with no destination but survival, and no peace but the memory of ruined skies and the echo of one last, unfulfilled vow. Dust to dust, blood to blood, shadow to shadow, the world slept fitfully, for one night was over, and another was just beginning.